Imagine standing in a freezing stone belfry, surrounded by tons of swinging bronze governed by ancient rigid laws. Medieval bell ringers weren't just musicians, they were mathematicians navigating complex permutations where no sequence was ever allowed to repeat. Tonight, we lose ourselves in the hypnotic, structural drone of this rhythmic geometry. Welcome back, traveler, to Boring History, a quiet corner of the world where we leave behind the noise of today and gently wander into the stillness of the past. Here the fires of history burn low and steady, casting long shadows over forgotten stories. We are not here for kings and conquests, but for the quiet, strange, and sometimes unsettling moments that time nearly buried. Before you get comfy, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, only if you're actually enjoying it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious to see the mix of places and time zones hanging out here together. Chapter I, the Foundry of First Light. In the year 1143, before the cathedral had walls, or even a name, there existed a foundry beside the river Essel, where the air always smelled of iron and old prayers. It was not a large building. From the outside it looked like any other workshop of its era, low-roofed, stone-walled, its single chimney exhaling a permanent thread of grey smoke that the local people had come to regard as a kind of landmark, a fixed point in the landscape as reliable as the hill behind the mill, or the bend in the river where the willows grew so thickly that summer turned the bank into a green wall. The foundry had been there for 30 years, and the man inside it had been there for all 30 of them, and between the man and the building a relationship had developed that was difficult to describe as anything other than mutual. The building held him. He held the building. They had shaped each other in the way that long cohabitation shapes all things imperceptibly, completely, in ways that only became visible when you imagined them apart. The master founder's name was Aurelius Vorn. He was 52 years old in the autumn of 1143, which in the 12th century made him a man of considerable age, and he carried those years not in the stooped, diminished way of men worn down by labor, but in the particular solidity of someone who has spent decades doing exactly the work they were made for. He was not tall, but he was broad through the shoulders and thick in the forearms, in the way of men who have worked at furnaces since boyhood. And his hands, the most important part of him, by his own reckoning, were remarkable. Large-knuckled, scarred in several places by metal and fire, but possessed of a sensitivity in the fingertips that he had spent 30 years deliberately cultivating. He could feel a change in the surface of a cooling bronze, casting that no instrument of the era could measure. He could detect by touch alone the difference between bronze that had cooled with a uniform crystal structure and bronze in which internal tensions had formed hairline stresses. He did not regard this ability as remarkable. He regarded it as the minimum competence required to do his work properly. He kept no apprentices and sought no pupils. This was unusual enough in an era when the guild system demanded the transmission of craft knowledge through exactly the hierarchies he refused, and it had cost him politically over the years. The Bronzecasters Guild of the regional capital had twice attempted to censure him for operating outside their oversight, twice been frustrated by the quality of his work and the patronage it attracted, and eventually arrived at a kind of sullen tolerance that suited everyone moderately well. Vorn was not opposed to the idea of teaching in principle. He was opposed to the specific teaching that the guild would have required him to deliver, which was teaching organized around tradition, around the accumulated practices of generations of competent craftsmen who had done things a certain way because their masters had done things that way, and because those things produced bells that rang adequately, that served their liturgical purpose, that satisfied the bishops and abbots who paid for them. Vorn did not want to make bells that rang adequately. He wanted to make bells that rang truthfully. And the tradition, as he had understood it since his early 20s, after a crisis of confidence so severe that it had kept him sleepless for an entire winter, had nothing to teach him about truth. Only mathematics did, only listening did. And those were disciplines you could not transmit to an apprentice who had not yet developed the patience to sit with failure for months without abandoning the question. He worked alone, then, and had done so for 3 decades, guided by something older than technique and more demanding than tradition, a discipline he had given the name forma subnans, the sounding form. The phrase was his own coinage, drawn from his reading of Boethius and from conversations with a monk he had known in his 30s, who had studied music theory at a monastery in the south, and who had introduced him to the ancient idea that musical intervals were not merely pleasant combinations of sounds, but were reflections of deeper mathematical harmonies embedded in the structure of the cosmos itself. Vorn had taken this idea, which the monk intended, in a theological sense, as evidence of divine order, and applied it with ruthless practicality to the problem of bronze. If harmony was mathematical, and mathematics was geometric, then the geometry of a bell was not merely a shape. It was a proposition about harmony, and a proposition, unlike a tradition, could be right or wrong. It could be tested. It could be improved. It could, in principle, be perfected. He believed, and had believed since he was a child, watching his father pour bronze into clay. That sound was not a thing that happened to the air. Sound was a thing that waited inside the metal, dormant and patient, and precisely defined by every curve and thickness and ratio of the form that held it, coiled in the relationship between height and diameter, sleeping in the precise angle at which a rim met the open world, folded into the subtle swelling of the bell's waist, where the profile passed through its most critical transition. A bell did not make sound when it was struck. A bell released sound, released what the geometry had always promised, fulfilled what the mathematics had already determined in the long cold hours after the pour, when the bronze was finding its crystal structure and the shape was becoming irrevocably itself. This was not mysticism. Vorn was a deeply practical man and distrustful of mysticism in all its forms. It was, to him, simply the correct description of what he observed. The sound was in the shape before the clapper ever moved. The striking only made it audible. The commission arrived on a Tuesday in early October, carried by a young monk named Brother Colm, whose order had sent him from the new cathedral site at Verenthis, 300 miles to the northwest, a journey he had accomplished partly by horse and partly on foot, partly in rain and partly in the first cold of an early autumn. He was perhaps 20 years old, with the earnest, slightly bewildered quality of someone who has been given an important responsibility and is not entirely certain he understands it. His sandals were white with road dust. He had a leather satchel over one shoulder, containing a letter, sealed with red wax bearing the bishop's personal mark, a small quantity of provisions for the return journey, and a notebook in which he had been instructed to record everything the founder said, so that an accurate report could be brought back to Verenthis. He was a careful and conscientious young man. He would prove to be a scrupulous reporter. The notebook survives, improbably, in a monastic archive in the modern Netherlands, and it is one of the few primary sources we have for the early stages of what would become the most ambitious bell-founding project of the 12th century. Vorn was at his drawing table when Colm arrived, working on a profile curve with a compass and a straight edge, and he did not immediately look up. This was not rudeness, or rather, it was a specific kind of rudeness that his few regular visitors had come to understand as a form of respect. He would finish his thought before acknowledging you, because interrupting a thought mid-calculation meant starting it again from the beginning, and he saw no reason to waste the work already done. Colm stood in the doorway for perhaps 2 minutes, looking at the walls covered in diagrams, at the furnace banked down to a steady glow, at the half-dozen bells in various stages of completion that hung or stood around the space, and at the extraordinary orderliness of everything, the tools arranged with a precision that went beyond neatness into something that looked almost ritualistic. Each instrument in its exact place, each surface cleared of everything that did not belong to the current work. When Vorn finally looked up and accepted the letter, he read it twice without any change of expression. The commission was, by any standard, extraordinary. The new Cathedral of Verenthis, a project already a decade in the building, the seat of a bishopric that was asserting its importance in the complex ecclesiastical politics of the region, required a ring of 7 bells. The largest was to weigh no less than 4,000 pounds, and to be heard, the bishop specified, with what Vorn regarded as a combination of ambition and profound acoustical naivety, across an entire valley. The remaining 6 bells were to descend in a tuned series, forming a complete ring suitable for the complex change-ringing traditions that the bishop wished to establish at his cathedral as a mark of its sophistication and theological seriousness. All 7 bells were to bear inscriptions selected by the bishop. All were to be completed and installed before the consecration of the cathedral, which was planned for 3 years hence. Vorn turned the letter over and looked at the back as though expecting more information on the other side. There was none. He set it on his workbench beside a cracked drawing compass, cracked along the lower arm in a way that made it unusable, but which Vorn kept as a reminder of a failure he chose not to forget, and he said nothing for a very long time. The fire in the furnace settled with a sound like a quiet exhalation. Outside, the river moved over its stones, with the cold indifference of things that do not need to think about what they are doing. Brother Colm stood in respectful silence, his notebook open, his charcoal ready, and waited. "When must they be finished?" Vorn asked at last. His voice was low and even, the voice of a man who had spent years listening and had learned, through that practice, to speak only when he had something worth saying. "Before the consecration," said Colm. 3 years hence, at the Feast of the Annunciation." Vorn picked up the drawing compass, the working one, not the broken one, and placed its point at the center of a circle he had drawn earlier that day. He began to move it in a slow arc, not completing the circle but tracing a partial curve, measuring something invisible. His eyes were not on the compass but on the middle distance, the place where a mind goes when it is doing real work. "Tell your bishop," he said finally, without looking up, "that 3 years is not sufficient time to make 7 bells worthy of a cathedral. It is, however, exactly sufficient time to make 1 bell worthy of a cathedral, and 6 bells worthy of hanging in the same tower as that 1 bell. That is what I will make. If he wants 7 bells made properly, he has 3 years. If he wants 7 bells made, well, he requires 9. Brother Colm wrote this down with the careful exactitude he had been trained to, underlining the distinction between properly and well, because it seemed, even to his young ears, important. "And if the bishop requires them in 3 years," he asked, "then he will have what 3 years makes possible," said Vorn. "Which is not nothing, but which is not what it could be." He set down the compass and looked at Colm directly for the first time. His eyes were pale grey, the kind of pale that in certain lights looks like no color at all. "I will accept the commission. 3 years, 1 bell that is as good as I can make it, 6 bells that are as good as 3 years, an honest work permit. Tell him that." Colm wrote it all down. He delivered it faithfully. The bishop, after considerable deliberation and one failed attempt to find another founder who would promise all 7 bells with equal quality in the allotted time, signed the contract. The bronze was purchased from a merchant in the capital at a price that made the cathedral's treasurer wince audibly. The transport arrangements were negotiated. The specifications were agreed in correspondence that stretched over 3 months of careful, occasionally combative letters, and on the first morning of October, with the trees along the river gone entirely to gold and the air carrying the first real bite of winter, Aurelius Vorn lit his main furnace to its working temperature, unrolled a set of drawings that he had been accumulating and revising for 20 years, drawings that no other human being had ever been permitted to study in full, and began the work that would take everything he had and produce. In the end, something that would still be measurably remarkable 9 centuries later, when a Danish researcher pointed a spectrometer at it in a cold stone tower and found the mathematics exactly as Hatron extractriat, and a cold stotru and statist. Tactric selaclis exactly as Azakri as a seclazaret clackly agit so collated with can in him at qued apican se with wet sense in with back gat with akats wake up with that wep up with hat pep with la pepper at pavak at apata avasa at half car persec to wapo go solo as vast mustic of dusas but scap at by chloe He began, as he always began, not with metal but with silence. He sat at his drawing table for the first full day, and did nothing visible. He was, by his own account, in a fragment of writing that survives, listening to the space that the bell would occupy, listening not to what was there but to what the bell's presence would change, what frequencies already lived in the stone and air of the eventual tower. What relationship would need to exist between this bell's voice and the silences and surfaces it would inhabit? A bell is not a freestanding object. It is a conversation between metal and space. Getting the metal right without understanding the space was like writing a letter without knowing the language of its recipient. Vorn understood this so deeply that it had become the foundation of his entire practice, the thing that made his work different from every other founder's work. The reason that the bells he made were not merely instruments but arguments, specific, intelligent, structurally honest arguments about the relationship between the geometry of a physical object and the acoustic reality of the world it would inhabit. He sat and listened to the future, and then which once it is salif, and when it courses sites, it was semtuin, then it comes font, then it would comment it to once crumunched in it. When which once crunch once crunch once crunch once crunch once once one when no cano need. when one one when one one quan when one well one whistle one when one will go with so with so for the wall so off the off go so was the with go with all fed out who the hat is off with a group of papa us the sap small with walk go more as walk these more. Chapter 2. The Geometry of Silence. Aurelius Vorn did not begin with metal. He never began with metal. Metal was the last step, the moment of commitment, after all the real work had been done, the physical embodiment of conclusions already reached, the translation into bronze of a conversation that had been conducted entirely in the abstract language of mathematics and proportion and trained acoustic perception. Beginning with metal, in Vorn's view, was the fundamental error of mediocre founders, and it explained the fundamental mediocrity of most bells. They were made in the wrong order. The craftsman poured the bronze and then listened to what he had made, adjusting by grinding and trimming, correcting by subtraction what should have been correct by design. It was the acoustic equivalent of writing a poem by producing random words and then rearranging them until something sounded right. It could produce results. It could never produce the result that was possible if you began by understanding what you were trying to say. Vorn began with mathematics. More precisely, he began with the walls of his workshop, which were his working memory externalized, a vast, layered, palimpsestic archive of diagrams, calculations, failed attempts, successful ones, and theoretical speculations that had been accumulating for 30 years in a density that was, to any visitor, either overwhelming or simply incomprehensible. There was no attempt at organization in the conventional sense. Papers and sheets of vellum were pinned or pasted in the order that the work had demanded them, which meant the order of thought rather than the order of subject, and following the progression of ideas across those walls required an intimate familiarity with the development of Vorn's thinking over 3 decades. Only he possessed that familiarity. Only he could walk into that room and read it as the continuous argument it actually was, a 30-year conversation with the problem that he believed, only now, in the Commission for Verenthis, close to answering fully. The problem was this: what is the complete mathematical description of a bell, such that any desired acoustic property of that bell pitch, overtone, harmony, duration of sustain, directional propagation of sound, the relationship between the strike tone and the hum tone and all the partial tones arrayed between and above them, can be determined in advance from the description, and such that any desired combination of acoustic properties can be achieved by designing the correct geometry from the outset. This was not a question that most of his contemporaries would have recognized as a question. Most of them would have said, experience tells you how to make bells, tradition tells you, you learn by watching and doing, and you improve by adjusting what the experience of striking tells you needs adjustment. The idea that the acoustic properties of a bell were so completely determined by its geometry that they could be mathematically predicted and designed in advance. This was not a framework that the craft tradition provided or supported. It was, however, a framework that the history of ideas provided, if he knew where to look. Vorn had been looking since he was in his 20s, when a chance encounter with a manuscript copy of Boethius's De Musica in the library of a local monastery had cracked something open in his understanding of what he was doing. Boethius, drawing on Pythagorean traditions that reached back to the ancient world, described musical intervals in terms of numerical ratios, the octave as 2:1, the perfect fifth as 3:2, the perfect fourth as 4:3, and argued that these ratios were not merely descriptions of pleasant combinations of sounds, but were expressions of a mathematical order that structured reality itself. From the orbits of planets to the proportions of the human body to the harmony of well-ordered music. Vorn had read this not as theology, which Boethius partly intended, and not as music theory, which Boethius primarily intended, but as a practical manual for bell founding, or rather, as a theoretical framework within which a practical manual for bell founding could be constructed if someone were willing to do the necessary experimental work. That someone had turned out to be him. For 30 years, between commissions, around commissions, in the long evenings when the furnace was banked and the day's physical work was done, he had been conducting a systematic program of experimentation, varying the profile curves of bells by measured increments, recording the acoustic results with the only instrument available to him, his own ears, trained to extraordinary precision through decades of deliberate practice and building up, slowly and at great personal cost in time and material, a body of empirical knowledge about the relationship between bell geometry and bell acoustics. the diagrams of places the towns were tasted, the diagrations the towns are was at the placides, circle places of placidid, circle places of conjectures and the kimshivs de serovs, serval places at serval places and kevries, Suries, Curies, Sorids, Curry, Kiriks, Piriki, Xorix, with Xeki and can recurred and canon in with when we call when war, cacao with taff with wow with so with was cook, called up off will off or hop with will cook, I'll cool what's with the fall I go or I'll go for how I guess cackle conclusions that he regarded as established facts, the bedrock of his understanding, the things he knew rather than merely believed. The central established fact, the one from which everything else followed, was this: a bell's acoustic profile, by which Vorn meant the complete set of frequencies it produced when struck, together with their relative amplitudes and rates of decay, was entirely and precisely determined by three geometrical parameters: the profile curve of the bell's wall, the relationship between the bell's diameter and its wall thickness at every point from crown to rim, the overall ratio of height to diameter, and the specific shape of the sound bow, the thickened band near the rim that receives the clapper's blow, and from which most of the acoustic energy radiates. Change any of these parameters by any amount, and every acoustic property of the bell changed in ways that were, he had demonstrated to his own satisfaction, mathematically predictable. The bell was not a mysterious object that made sound in ways that could only be learned through experience. The bell was a mathematical function. If you knew the geometry, you could calculate the sound. If you wanted a specific sound, you could, in principle, calculate the geometry. In principle was the difficult part. The actual mathematics was ferociously complex, because the acoustic profile of a bell is not a simple thing. When a bell is struck, it does not produce a single tone. It produces a complex superposition of multiple tones simultaneously, what acousticians would later call the partial tones or partials of the bell. The most important of these have names in the campanological tradition: the hum, the lowest tone, an octave below the nominal; the prime or fundamental, the main strike tone; the tierce, a minor third above the prime; the quint, a fifth above the prime; and the nominal, an octave above the prime, which determines the bell's perceived musical pitch. These five principal partials are the ones that matter most for the bell's musical character, and achieving the correct harmonic relationships between them, ensuring they are in tune with each other in the specific ways that produce a harmonious, rather than discordant composite sound, requires a profile geometry of considerable precision. Getting all five partials into their correct relationships simultaneously is an exercise in multivariable optimization that, without the computational tools of later centuries, required either a very long tradition of empirical refinement, or a very good mathematical refinement, or a very good mathematical refinement, or a very good matemat, or a very good bellikin. A good bad eclectic with for presser plor to with prepared but por plep bipe ward pa up third with how with had the dow said that looks and cock bad with that but pat it with whip up war the pa wog sigak up far ak with quack alcaba has papa curry this book out pupet was first moon was suspected of Vorn had spent 30 years building the mathematical model, but the thing that truly distinguished him, the thing that was his real secret, the discovery that his workshop walls were ultimately organized around, was not the five principal partials. Every competent founder paid attention to those. Vorn's discovery concerned what came after them, the higher partials, the secondary and tertiary overtones that most founders either ignored or regarded as untamable noise, and the specific mathematical relationships between all the partials taken together, not merely the principal five. He had found through an accumulation of observations so painstaking and so systematically recorded that it constitutes, in retrospect, a genuine scientific program. that when the higher partials of a bell were tuned not just to harmonic intervals but to specific proportional ratios that he had derived from a combination of Pythagorean theory and his own empirical work, something extraordinary happened to the composite sound. The partials did not merely add to each other, they interacted. The interference between them, the beating that occurs when two tones of similar but not identical frequency are sounded simultaneously, created a temporal pattern in the amplitude of the composite sound, a rhythm within the sustained tone, a pulse. He called this phenomenon pulsatio geometrica, the geometric pulse, and he had been deliberately engineering it into his bells for over a decade, with increasing precision and increasing confidence as his mathematical understanding of its causes deepened. What the pulse meant to him, why he regarded it as the most important thing he had discovered, was a question that his practical writings did not fully address. He was not a man given to philosophical elaboration in his working notes, which were terse, technical, and written in a Latin that was more engineering specification than humanistic prose. But in the fragmentary personal writings that survive, letters, marginal annotations, the occasional undated reflections scrawled in the back of a calculation notebook, the outlines of a larger understanding are visible. The pulse, he believed, was the geometry speaking, not the geometry of the bell alone, but the geometry of sound itself, the deeper mathematical order of which harmonic intervals were surface expressions, made audible in time as a rhythm rather than in pitch as a tone. It was the frozen mathematics of the bell's shape, translated by vibration into something moving and temporal. It was, in his phrase, proof that the proposition was correct, that the shape had been right, that the mathematics had been honestly done, that the bell was telling the truth about itself, that this truth was perceptible, even if only faintly, even if only two trained ears he had confirmed in the only way available to him, by listening to his own bells, obsessively, at every distance and in every acoustic environment he could arrange, and by occasionally, carefully, asking others to listen. Most heard nothing unusual. A few heard something that they could not name. None, in 30 years, had ever heard exactly what Isera would hear. But the absence of listeners did not diminish the phenomenon. The pulse was in the bell regardless of whether anyone perceived it. The geometry was true whether or not anyone read it. Vorn found this not discouraging, but philosophically clarifying, in the way that a mathematical proof is true regardless of whether anyone studies it. He was not making bells for listeners. He was making bells for mathematics, for the Verenthis Commission, for the great bell at the center of it, the 4,000-pound instrument that was to carry across a valley. He began his calculations with a period of almost unprecedented intensity, even by his standards. He had 3 years and a single bell to get completely right, and the constraints imposed by the Commission's size requirements meant that he was operating at a scale he had never previously attempted. A bell of 4,000 pounds is not simply a scaling of a bell of 400 pounds. The relationship between mass, geometry, and acoustic behavior is non-linear. Larger bells do not simply produce louder versions of what smaller bells produce, and the mathematical relationships he had established through his experiments on smaller instruments could not simply be extrapolated upward without revision. He had to start again from his principles, rebuilding the calculations for the new scale, checking and rechecking the proportional relationships that would govern the profile of a bell whose rim diameter would exceed 6 feet. He worked at his drawing table through October and November of 1143. The fire in his furnace kept at minimum temperature for warmth rather than work. The workshop cold enough in the mornings that his breath made small clouds above the vellum. He drew and calculated and erased and redrew. He consulted his records of every bell he had ever made, looking for the empirical anchors that would let him verify his derivations. He made small test castings, nothing like the eventual bell, just small discs and partial profiles, curved sections of bronze that he struck with a tuning fork and listened to with his eyes closed and his hand resting on the vibrating metal to feel what the air could not carry. And from these he refined his understanding of how the proportions he was working with would behave at scale. He worked in silence, not merely in physical silence, though the foundry was, when the furnace was cool and the town quiet on winter mornings, genuinely very still, but in the internal silence of someone who has developed through long practice the ability to hold a complex problem in sustained attention without the interference of commentary or impatience or the desire for premature resolution. He was, in the most precise sense, thinking. And in the second month of this thinking, on a morning when the first real snow of winter was falling on the river and the river was dark between white banks, He drew a curve, a specific profile for the section of the great bell between the waist and the sound bow, that was different from any curve he had drawn before. He studied it for a long time. He calculated its predicted acoustic implications. He checked the calculation 3 times. Then he drew a small circle beside it in the margin of the vellum, and wrote inside it, in letters so small they required a magnifying glass to read when the notebook was later found, a single Latin word: hoc. This was the one. Chapter 3, The Master's Ear. The young woman appeared at the foundry door on a morning in late March of the 2nd year, when the first real warmth had returned to the river valley, and the trees along the SL had gone from bare grey to a tentative, provisional green. She had walked from the mill district on the south side of town, a neighbourhood of modest craftsmen's houses, workshops, and the constant smell of the river, which in spring carried the particular combination of cold water and warming mud that is the smell of the season before it is anything else. She arrived without announcement and without introduction, standing in the doorway with her hands at her sides and her chin at an angle that suggested she had thought carefully about what she was going to say and was prepared to defend it against any reasonable objection. Her name, she said, was Isara. She was the daughter of a coppersmith who had died 6 years earlier, and she had since that time worked in his shop alongside her older brother, who now ran the business and who would be annoyed, she acknowledged without particular concern, that she had taken the morning for this errand. She had heard, over the course of her life, perhaps 200 individual bells, in chapels, cathedrals, parish churches, monastery towers, the bells of ships on the river, the small bells of market stalls, and the larger bells of civic announcements. She had been listening to bells with close attention since she was a small child, for reasons that she had never been able to explain to anyone's satisfaction, including her own. She simply found them interesting in a way that resisted reduction to anything simpler. She had not come to ask for work. She had come because of something she had heard 2 weeks ago in the small chapel of St. Endis, 6 miles up the valley, where one of Vorn's bells hung a bell cast 4 years earlier for a private commission, installed without ceremony in a chapel that was too small for it, where it spent its existence being rung by a single elderly verger who treated it with the perfunctory efficiency of someone performing an unavoidable duty. She had gone there because a woman in the market had mentioned, in passing and without apparent significance, that the bell at St. Endis was not like other bells, and Isara had gone to verify this in the only way available, by listening. She stood in the small stone interior of the chapel and listened to the bell ring for the terse observance, which the verger performed with such speed that the sequence was over in approximately 4 minutes. She stood very still through all 4 minutes. Then she stood still for another 5 minutes after the sound had died, because what she had heard was so unexpected that she needed the silence to confirm that she had actually heard it and not imagined it. She left the chapel and walked around the outside of the building to stand beneath the bell tower and asked the verger to ring 3 single strokes, one at a time, with a long interval between them. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has encountered enough unusual requests in a long life that he no longer assigns them moral significance and simply accommodates them if it requires no extraordinary effort. He rang the bell 3 times. Isara stood in the cold with her eyes closed and her attention entirely on the sustained tone of each stroke, listening not to the beginning of the sound but to its middle, the long, gradual decay after the initial strike, where most people's attention drifted because there was nothing new happening, and heard it again, clearly, unmistakably, in all 3 strokes. Then she walked home and spent 2 weeks thinking about it before walking to the foundry. When Vorn asked her to describe what she had heard, she did not reach for metaphor or approximation. She was not that kind of person. She thought for a moment, organizing her perception into language with the same care she would have applied to a technical problem, and then she described it systematically. The conventional voices of the bell, she said she used the right words, the words of campanological tradition, which told him immediately that she had not arrived at her understanding by accident, were all present and in their correct relationships. The strike tone was clean, the hum was appropriately low, the tierce and quint were where they should be, the nominal was correct. All of this was the expectation for any well-made bell, and Vorn's bells was certainly that. But underneath those voices, sustained through the full decay of the tone, even as the upper partials diminished and fell away, she had heard something that she could only describe as a rhythm, not a pitch, not a harmony, a rhythm, as if the bell were breathing, as if it were marking time against some internal measure, as if, she said, choosing this word carefully and watching his face as she said it, the bell were counting something. Aurelius Vorn set down the bronze fitting he had been working on and placed it with great precision on his workbench. He did this slowly and deliberately, not because precision was required. The bench was large enough that precision was irrelevant, but because he needed to do something with his hands that was not entirely invisible. And a man of his habits could not simply let his hands hang at his sides. He was, behind his expression of neutral attention, as startled as he had been by anything in 30 years of work. Not because what she described was wrong, because it was exactly right, because she had heard, unaided, untrained in his specific system, guided only by a lifetime of attentive listening and the native acuity of exceptional ears, the phenomenon that he had spent a decade deliberately encoding in his bells, and that no one, no other person, in all the years he had been doing it, had ever spontaneously noticed or described. The pulsatio geometrica, the geometric pulse. She had heard it and named it, not by his name, but correctly, essentially, in the language available to her. "Sit down," he said. She sat, with the composure of someone who has been expecting an interesting conversation and is settling in for it. He sat across from her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The furnace breathed its steady warmth. Outside, the river moved over its stones. Then Vorn asked her a series of questions, careful, specific questions, each one designed to establish exactly how much of what she described was accurate perception and how much was interpretation layered over a simpler experience. He asked her to characterize the rhythms of speed. He asked whether it was constant through the bell's decay, or whether it changed. He asked whether it was present in the attack, the first moment of the strike, or only in the sustained tone afterward. He asked, with particular care, whether she had noticed any difference between the rhythm's character when she was standing inside the chapel and when she was standing outside beneath the tower. Her answers were, to a degree that increased his astonishment with each one, precise. She had noticed that the rhythm was not present in the first fraction of a second after the strike. She had noticed that it was cleaner, more distinct, less obscured by room reflections outside than inside. She had noticed that it seemed to slow very slightly as the tone decayed toward silence, in the way that a singer's vibrato sometimes widens as the breath runs out. All of this was correct. All of it reflected observations that Vorn had made himself over years of systematic listening to his own bells, and that he had recorded in his notebooks as empirical facts requiring theoretical explanation. The slight slowing of the pulse rate during decay was a consequence of the way the relative amplitudes of the partial tones changed as the sound died. The specific partials whose interference produced the pulse decayed at slightly different rates, which altered the beat frequency of their interference pattern over time. Izara had heard this with her ears. He had derived it from mathematics and confirmed it by listening, but the listening had required him to know what to listen for. She had known what to listen for through no preparation other than a lifetime's habit of close attention. He asked her one final question. Had she heard anything similar in any other bell? Anywhere, in all the bells she had listened to over her life? She considered this seriously for a moment. "Not the same," she said. "Other bells have something a beating between tones, sometimes an unevenness that is not quite tuning, but that is disorder. What I heard in yours is not disorder. It is too regular. She searched for the word. Too intentional, because it is intentional," Vorn said. And then, having never told anyone this in 30 years of solitary work, he told her everything. The conversation lasted the rest of that day and into the evening. She asked questions that were, by turns, technical and philosophical, naive and extraordinarily perceptive. She understood the mathematics when he explained it, not with the fluency of formal training, but with the practical facility of someone who had spent years working with copper alloys, and therefore understood, from direct experience, that materials had properties that were not arbitrary but were necessary consequences of their physical nature. She understood the acoustic logic, the interference of partial tones, the generation of beat frequencies, more quickly than he expected, because she had been, without knowing it, observing these phenomena in bells her whole life, and had accumulated a body of empirical knowledge that she had simply never had a framework for. Giving her the framework was like giving a very good reader grammar. She did not need to learn the rules from scratch. She needed only to be shown that the rules she had been following intuitively were real. He hired her that evening, using a word he had never previously needed to use in any professional context. Listener, not apprentice, not assistant, not journeyman, listener. He explained the distinction clearly. He did not need someone to learn his techniques, to carry on his methods after his death. to become a founder in his tradition. He needed someone with better ears than he had, or rather, ears that had been developed differently, that had reached maturity through a different kind of use, that listened to bells as music rather than as technical artifacts, and had therefore preserved a quality of innocent attention that his own ears, trained to his specific analytical purposes, had partly lost. He needed someone who could hear what the bell sounded like, to someone who was not him. He could provide the mathematics, she could provide the truth test, not whether the calculations were correct, but whether what the calculations produced, in actual resonating bronze, was actually what he had intended to make. She was his instrument for measuring the gap between design and reality. She accepted the arrangement with a directness that suggested she had already decided before she came that she would accept any reasonable offer of work that allowed her to spend time listening to extraordinary bells. In the months that followed, before the first bell was cast, Isara became something that she had not anticipated becoming. A collaborator, not in the formal sense, not in any way that the guild system would have recognized or that either of them would have described that way to an outsider, but in the functional sense that the work changed in its nature by virtue of her presence in it. Vorn was a man who had spent his career conducting an interior dialogue with a problem, and the interior dialogue had been extraordinarily productive, but it had also been, inevitably, constrained by the limits of a single perspective. Having Isara there, listening to his reasoning and responding to it with perceptions that his reasoning had not predicted, hearing things in his test castings that redirected his calculations, asking questions that illuminated the assumptions he had been making without realizing they were assumptions, changed the texture and the velocity of the work in ways that surprised him. He was better at the mathematics alone. He was better at the whole problem together. This was, for a man who had chosen solitude as a professional philosophy for 30 years, a fact of some significance. He did not discuss it with her. He simply acknowledged it internally and continued working. Chapter 4. A Bell's First Cry. The pour happened on a Tuesday morning in the last week of November of the second year, when the world outside the foundry had entered that particular phase of late autumn in which the days are short and grey and the cold has lost the crispness of early winter and settled into a damp, pervasive chill that gets into everything, into clothing and stone, and even, it seems, into the character of the light, which falls without enthusiasm and accomplishes only the minimum required of it. The river was high from recent rains, its color the color of old pewter, and it moved with a purposefulness that the summer river did not possess, as though the added water had given it an urgency it would later lose. From inside the foundry, where the temperature around the furnace was close to unbearable and the temperature near the walls was merely uncomfortable, the river was audible as a low, continuous presence, not the gentle sound of summer, but a deeper, more insistent voice that seemed, on the morning of the pour, like an appropriate accompaniment to what was about to happen. Vorn had been awake for 36 hours. He had spent the previous day and night in the final stages of mold preparation, not because the physical work required that long, though it required a great deal, but because the last hours before a pour were the hours he used to verify everything, to walk through the entire preparation with the systematic thoroughness that he applied to every critical moment of his work, checking each element not against his original specification but against the current state of the mold, the furnace, and his understanding of what could go wrong. He was not a man given to anxiety. He was, constitutionally, the opposite of anxious, possessed of a steadiness that people who did not know him well sometimes mistook for coldness, but he was a man who had learned, through the specific education of catastrophic failure in his early career, that the cost of inattention in the hours before, that the cost of inattention in the hours before, that the cost of a course of the core to be, in a pair, with a pepe clause of spexipra, in wit da petapapa, in wit queer, in to pup with witson, esp with ass, sap with us at whistle, mip with back up, a black dababa, tapat I bark, hackuk buck gut, up, what did the power up ass, up, back, asked about. Or up at that out Bascas goes Gustavak but months of work destroyed, and the particular kind of loss that comes not from bad luck but from negligence. He had ruined bells that way twice in his life. He had decided, after the second time, that he would never do so again, and the way he had ensured this was not by being more careful, but by being more systematic. building the pre-pour check into the day's structure as an invariant ritual that happened regardless of how confident he felt, regardless of how well the preparation had gone, because confidence was the specific mental state in which inattention was most likely. The clay mold was his masterwork of patience even before the bronze entered it. He had been building it for 4 months, since the profile curve was finalized in July and the dimensions were calculated down to the last fraction of an inch. Mold making for a bell of this size was an art with its own complete technical vocabulary and its own complete set of ways to fail. The mold consisted of 2 main elements: the cope, the outer form that would shape the exterior of the bell, and the core, the inner form that would shape the interior. Between them, the gap of precise and varying width through which the bronze would flow was the bell, or rather, the space the bell would occupy, defined with total precision by the geometry of the 2 opposing surfaces. Getting those surfaces right, at every point across the complex compound curve of the bell's profile, was the work of 4 months of layering, drying, checking, correcting, and patient Vorn had built the mold from the inside out, beginning with the core, a central form built around a rotating template cut precisely to his profile specification, used to shape successive layers of loam mixed with horse dung and ground charcoal into the exact profile required. Each layer had to dry completely before the next was applied, and the drying had to happen at a controlled rate. Too fast, and the layer cracked, requiring removal and replacement. Too slow, and the outer surface remained soft, deforming under the weight of the next layer. He had managed this by building a drying chamber around the mold, adjusting its temperature with a small additional fire, monitoring the moisture content of the loam by touch at regular intervals throughout the day and, during critical phases, through the night. The cope had been built by a similar process, worked around an exterior template, checked against the core at every stage to ensure that the gap between them, the space that would become the bell's wall, maintained precisely the varying thickness that his calculations required. The thickness at the sound bow, which was the most acoustically critical part of the entire form, had been checked and rechecked so many times that the checking itself had become a kind of prayer, a ritual acknowledgement of how much was at stake at that particular point in the curve. Embedded in the clay of the mold were 2 additional elements that were Vorn's own innovations, not part of the standard mold-making practice of the era. The first was horsehair, worked into the loam mixture in specific proportions and orientations at the sections of the mold most vulnerable to thermal shock during the pour. Horsehair burns out as the bronze enters, but it leaves behind a microstructure of tiny channels in the clay that allows that sudden intense heat to distribute more evenly rather than concentrating at the surface and causing explosive cracking. Vorn had developed this technique after observing, in his mid-30s, a mold failure that he traced to differential thermal expansion at a specific point in the cope, and had refined it over subsequent castings to the point where it was now a standard part of his mold preparation for any large bell. The second innovation was more unusual, a series of very fine sand channels, too narrow to allow any bronze to enter them, worked into the outer layers of the mold at calculated positions to allow the escape of gases that would otherwise be trapped during the pour and could cause voids in the casting. He had derived the positions of these channels from his understanding of the bronze's flow dynamics, the way the liquid metal would move through the mold as it filled, and they were one of the things he was most specific about protecting during the final mold preparation. Izara arrived at the foundry before dawn, as Vorn had requested. She was carrying her recording materials, bark sheets, charcoal sticks, a small notebook, and she was wearing, over her usual clothing, a heavy woolen apron borrowed from her brother's workshop. She had been present at smaller castings before, during her months at the foundry, but nothing approaching this scale. The furnace, when she entered, was at working temperature, a heat that was not merely warm but was a physical presence, a weight of thermal energy that she felt on her face and the backs of her hands immediately on crossing the threshold. The light from the furnace mouth was orange-white and wavering, and it turned everything in the foundry into something partway between a normal workshop and an illuminated manuscript of itself. Familiar objects at unusual intensities, shadows deeper and more absolute than ordinary, the surface of the mold gleaming faintly in the adjacent light as though it had its own slow luminosity. The bronze, 4,240 pounds of it, a number arrived at through calculation rather than convention, representing Vorn's precise determination of the weight required to produce the wall thickness and profile curvature he had designed, had been assembled in the crucible furnace over 3 days, charged in quantities small enough to maintain thermal uniformity throughout the melt. The alloy was 80% copper and 20% tin, which was the standard bell bronze composition of the era, a composition arrived at by centuries of empirical practice because it produced an alloy with the right combination of hardness, elasticity, and internal damping for bell acoustics. To this standard composition, Vorn had added a quantity of silver from his own small reserve of the metal, a small but not insignificant proportion, the result of an idea he had developed over the previous decade and tested on smaller castings. His hypothesis, which he had not published, shared, or discussed with anyone because it existed at the edge of his technical understanding, in the territory of observation not yet fully explained, was that silver, distributed through the bronze crystal structure at the grain boundaries, modified the surface quality of the casting in a way that affected the propagation of the high-frequency, partial tones responsible for the bell's brilliance and clarity. The evidence he had gathered from his test castings was suggestive rather than conclusive. For the great bell of Verenthis, he had decided to include it, because the potential improvement justified the cost, and because the silver, at worst, would make no difference, and he was not the kind of man who left a possible improvement untried for fear of the investment. When the bronze was ready, determined by temperature, observation, and by the specific behavior of a sample ladled onto a stone and watched for the signs of correct heat and fluidity that could not be measured but could be recognized, Vorn reviewed the mold one final time. He walked round it completely, bending to examine the runner and gate system through which the bronze would flow, pressing a hand briefly to the outer cope surface to assess the temperature of the clay, checking the position and security of the pouring basin at the top. He checked the equipment that would be used to tilt and control the crucible. He confirmed that the pit into which excess bronze would be directed was clear and properly prepared. He straightened, looked at Isara, who was positioned with her recording materials at the angle and distance that gave her the best overall view without placing her in danger, and said one word: ready. The pour itself took 11 minutes and 12 seconds. Isara timed it, noting the start when the first bronze entered the runner and the end when Vorn signaled the cut and the flow was redirected. 11 minutes and 12 seconds, during which approximately 4,000 pounds of liquid bronze traveled from the crucible through the runner system and into the gap between cope and core, filling from the bottom upward, as Vorn had designed. The bronze moving with a dense, slow purposefulness that was not quite like any liquid Isara had previously observed. It was too heavy for the word fluid to feel accurate. It moved like something that knew it was becoming something else, reluctantly, with gravity. Displacing the air it replaced through the gas escape channels that Vorn had engineered into the mold, the escaping gases burning off at the channel outlets in brief blue flames that appeared and vanished like signals. The sound it made was not dramatic. It was a deep, steady, liquid sound, low enough to feel in the chest rather than merely hear with the ears, which Isara noted in her record, with the specific observation that the sound of the pour already suggested the bell's fundamental frequency, as though the bronze were announcing in advance what it would become. When the flow stopped and Vorn sealed the runner, the mold sat complete and full in its pit, radiating heat that was visible as a distortion of the air above it. The surface of the sealed runner was dark already, the bronze there beginning its long journey from liquid to solid to permanent. Vorn stood and looked at it for a long time. Then he sat down on an upturned wooden bucket, the only seat in the foundry that was not a stool or a chair, but which he used. Isara had noticed, specifically for moments when the work had reached a transition point and there was nothing to do but wait, and looked at the sealed mold with an expression that she found difficult to characterize. It was not satisfaction, or not primarily. It was something more neutral, more exact. It was the face of a man in the presence of a fact that has been made irreversible, and which must now simply be waited for, the way one waits for a judgment that has been rendered but not yet read aloud. "What happens to the bronze now?" she asked, not because she did not know the general answer, but because she wanted his specific answer. "It cools," he said. "The crystal structure forms. The bell decides what it is." He paused. "We have told it what we want it to be. Now it does what all things do with what they are told. It interprets." She wrote this down. He looked at her writing it down, and did not object, which was as close as he came, in her experience, to approval. She was writing in her bark-sheet notebook so fast that her charcoal broke. She used the broken end. She wrote, in Latin, one sentence that she later copied into her formal record without change. "The pulse reaches where the voice does not. This is what it was designed for. Now I understand. When she told Vorn what she had found, he did not react with the excitement she expected. He was already at his drawing table, adjusting a calculation, and he said, "How far?" She told him. He made a notation. Then he said, without looking up, "The pulse was always designed to carry further than the tone. That is its function. What you have confirmed is the distance. I calculated 400 meters. You have measured it. These are the same thing, arrived at by different methods." He made another notation. "Good." She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him work. Then she said, "You designed it to carry to the edge of the valley, before the tower was built, before the bell was cast, before you had any empirical evidence that your calculation was correct." "Yes," he said. "That is either very confident," she said, "or very something else that I do not have a word for." "Mathematics," he said. "It is the word you are looking for." Chapter 6. Patterns in the Dark. The winter that followed the testing was the winter of the calculations, a season of intensive work that Isra later described. In a letter written decades afterward, when she was trying to explain to a student what the Verenthis Commission had actually been, as the most intellectually demanding period she had ever witnessed in another person's work, and the most productive, the Great Bell was finished. It had validated the theory. Now the remaining 6 bells had to be made, and the making of them required a kind of thinking that was different from, and in some ways more difficult than anything that had come before. The challenge of designing a complete bell tower ring is not simply the challenge of designing 7 good bells. Any reasonably skilled founder can design 7 good bells. A good bell is a matter of careful craftsmanship, attention to proportion, and sufficient empirical experience of what works. 7 good bells hanging in the same tower, however, do not automatically constitute a good ring. They constitute 7 separate instruments in proximity, and whether their proximity creates music or chaos depends entirely on the acoustic relationships between them, on whether they are tuned to each other, whether their voices support and clarify each other's voices or compete and obscure them, whether the experience of hearing all 7 ring together is the experience of a unified instrument or the experience of a crowd. Getting all 7 bells right individually is necessary. Getting their relationships right is the actual work. The mathematical framework for the harmonic relationships between bells in a ring was already established in Vorn's era, at least in its basic outlines, by the accumulated practical experience of generations of change-ringing tradition. Bells in a ring were typically tuned to a diatonic scale, each bell a specific degree above or below its neighbor in the standard musical series of tones and semitones, so that they could be rung in the combinations and sequences that change ringing demanded without producing obvious tonal clashes. The traditional approach to achieving this was to cast each bell to approximately the right size, size being the primary determinant of pitch. Larger bells producing lower tones, and then adjust by grinding after casting to bring the tones into tune. It was a method that worked well enough for the purpose of producing a functional ring, and it was used without significant variation throughout the European campanological tradition. Vorn did not use this method. He had not used it in any bell he had made for the past 15 years, because he regarded it as acoustically dishonest, not in the sense of dishonest behavior, but in the sense of mathematical falsehood. Grinding a bell after casting changes not only its pitch, but all of its partial tones and their relationships to each other, in ways that are difficult to control and essentially impossible to predict with precision. A bell that was poorly proportioned and then ground to pitch was a bell whose acoustic profile was the result of 2 competing geometries, the one intended by the design and the one produced by the correction, and the combination of competing geometries almost invariably produced an acoustic profile less coherent than either would have produced alone. A bell that started from a correct design needed no grinding. Its profile, being mathematically right, produced all the right tones in all the right relationships, without intervention. This required better mathematics at the design stage. It was worth it. For the 6 remaining Verenthis bells, Vorn had to design not merely 6 individually correct profiles, but 6 profiles that were correct in relation to each other and in relation to the great bell already cast. This was a problem of a different order of complexity than any he had previously addressed. In designing the great bell, he had been working with a single instrument and a single set of acoustic constraints. In designing the remaining 6, he had 7 acoustic constraints, the bells themselves, and they were not independent. The tuning of each bell affected the tuning requirements of every other bell it would ring with. because the tonal relationships between bells were determined not by absolute pitch alone, but by the interval relationships between the partial tones of different bells sounding simultaneously. Two bells that were individually perfectly tuned could produce unpleasant beats when rung together if their partial structures were not mutually compatible. Vorn had observed this phenomenon in other rings. It was the explanation for the specific kind of tonal mud that characterized many otherwise competent multi-bell installations, and had thought about its causes for years. The Verenthis Commission was the first opportunity he had had to apply his conclusions at the scale of a full 7-bell ring. What made this winter's work genuinely extraordinary, what Isara was referring to when she said, decades later, that it was the most demanding thinking she had ever witnessed, was that Vorn was pursuing something beyond even the standard of mutual compatibility between bells. He was not merely trying to design 6 bells that rang well together with the great bell. He was trying to design 6 bells whose pulsations geometricae, whose individual geometric pulses were calculated to interact with each other, and with the great bell's pulse in specific, planned ways when the bells were rung together. He was trying to design a superpulse, a temporal pattern that existed not in any single bell's voice but in the interference between all 7 voices simultaneously, a rhythm of a different character and a different scale than anything any individual bell could produce. A rhythm, in other words, that could only exist in the presence of all 7 bells ringing together, and that would cease to exist the moment any single bell was silent. This was not a modest ambition. It was, by the standards of 12th century mechanical possibility, barely conceivable as an ambition, like trying to choreograph the interference patterns of 7 different voices singing simultaneously, designing the beating not between pitches but between rhythms, working at 3 levels of acoustic organization at once: the individual tones, the individual pulses, and the aggregate superpulse that arose from all 7 pulses interacting. The mathematics required to design this was not mathematics that existed formally in Vorn's era. He was inventing it as he needed it, drawing on his Pythagorean framework for the tonal relationships, extending that framework into the temporal domain for the pulse calculations, and checking his theoretical work against the empirical evidence of his test castings and the great bell's measured behavior at every step. His notebooks from this period, the period that Isra described as the winter of the calculations, are the most densely worked of all his surviving documents, pages in which the diagrams overlap each other because he had run out of clear space and had to write over earlier work. Pages in which the same calculation appears 3 or 4 times in slightly different forms, each version a refinement of the previous, pages that begin in his characteristic precise Latin and end in something closer to personal shorthand, the formality abandoned in the urgency of trying to get the thought down before it slipped away. Isra's contribution during this period was different from what it had been during the design and testing of the great bell. She was not primarily listening now. There was nothing to listen to yet. She was thinking, which was something she had discovered, with some surprise, that she was capable of doing at the level Vorn's work required. She had spent the winter reading the same texts Vorn had used, the Bothian tradition, the Arabic music theory that had been filtering into European intellectual life through the translation movements of the previous century, and a manuscript on proportional mathematics that Vorn had obtained at considerable expense from a monastery in the south, and which was his most treasured theoretical reference. She was not, by her own assessment, a mathematician by nature or training, but she was a precise thinker and a very fast learner, and she had, by now, 8 months of immersive experience in Vorn's way of approaching acoustic problems, which meant that she had internalized enough of his framework to follow his reasoning and, occasionally, to add to it. Her specific contribution was in the domain of what she called the listener's constraints, the acoustic requirements that the superpulse had to satisfy, not merely on paper, but in actual human perception. Vorn's calculations could produce a theoretical superpulse of any desired character, but a superpulse that was theoretically perfect was useless if it was not perceptible to actual human listeners, and perceptibility, Isara understood from experience, was not a mathematical property. It was a perceptual one. It depended on the psychology of auditory attention, on what a listener could and could not distinguish from the acoustic background of a full 7-bell ring, on how the characteristics of the pulse related to the temporal resolution of human hearing. She had no formal training in these questions. She had 30 years of listening, which she was increasingly confident was a more relevant qualification. The debate between them about the optimal pulse frequency, how fast the superpulse should beat, lasted 3 weeks, and was, by Isra's account, the most sustained intellectual argument she had ever participated in. Vorn's calculations predicted an optimal frequency of approximately 4 cycles per second, which fell in a range he could achieve through the specific partial tone ratios he had designed. Isera argued, on the basis of her listening experience, that 4 cycles per second was too fast, that at this rate, the pulse would not be perceived as a coherent rhythm, but as a tonal roughness, a slight harshness in the combined sound that sensitive listeners would notice as unpleasant but not identify as rhythmic. She argued for a rate closer to 2 cycles per second, slow enough to be perceived as a deliberate pulse, fast enough to feel connected and continuous rather than intermittent. Vorn spent 2 days recalculating whether this was achievable within the proportional system he had established for the ring, discovered that it was achievable, but only if he modified the profile of the 5th bell, the bell he had already begun mold preparation for, in ways that would require restarting a month's work. Argued that his calculation of perceptibility was correct and hers was incorrect, listened to her counter-argument, and then sat in silence for so long that she thought he had stopped listening. When he finally spoke, he said, "Your argument is correct in its premises, but not in its conclusion. 2 cycles per second is too slow. The pulse will be felt as a vibration, not heard as a rhythm. 3 is the answer. 3 is between your estimate and mine." He paused. "I will recalculate for 3. Restart the 5th mold." The 5th mold was restarted. The calculations were revised for a superpulse frequency of 3 cycles per second. The remaining 5 profile designs were re-derived in light of this revision. Isera recorded all of it with her usual thoroughness and noted in the margin of the page on which she recorded Vorn's final acceptance of the 3-cycle figure, a single word in her own hand, "correct." She did not specify to which aspect of the conclusion she was applying this judgment. She did not need to. They both knew what it meant. It meant that by the time the second winter gave way to the third and final spring of the commission, all 7 bells had been designed to a standard of acoustic precision that had no parallel in the history of Campanology. 6 of them were still clay in calculation. 1 hung in a temporary frame in a cold field behind a foundry in a river town that most people had never heard of, but all 7 were, in the deepest sense, already made. The mathematics was complete. The geometry was determined. The bronze, when it came, would only be doing what the drawings had already decided. 7 bells, designed to ring as a single instrument of extraordinary complexity, to produce at their center a rhythm drawn not from music but from mathematics, not from tradition but from a theory of the relationship between geometric form and acoustic truth, that one man and one woman, working in the specific productive tension of their complementary abilities, had constructed from first principles over the better part of 3 years. They still had to be cast, but in every sense that mattered to Aurelius Vorn, the work was already done. Chapter 7. The Tower of 7 Voices. The journey from the foundry to Verenthis took 3 weeks in early spring of the 3rd year, undertaken with a deliberateness of preparation that reflected Vorn's understanding that the transportation of 4 bronze bells, 3 already finished, 3 completed in the final winter push, was not a logistical problem so much as a continuation of the acoustic work itself. A bell damaged in transit was not merely a financial loss. It was a physical argument, broken mid-sentence, a mathematical truth cracked along a stress line that no amount of post-damage repair could fully restore. Bronze that has been subjected to impact trauma develops internal stress fractures that are invisible to the eye but audible to the trained ear as a subtle deadening in the sustain, a shortening of the decay curve, a slight muddying in the upper partials that no grinding or surface treatment can remedy because the corruption is in the crystal structure of the metal itself, not in its surface. Vorn had lost a bell to transport once, in his early career, a medium-sized tenor for a village church that had been dropped from a wagon crossing a ford and had struck a submerged stone with an impact that looked on the surface entirely servolit. Entirely surface, entirely satarily, entirely sartarily, entirely liets and tauxicor, intan, to risim selka, and bear poet imsan, some for gisk put we put up with sad that's look, get with pupa happus mep warpat we put to have we got habitat pet. Got we have that had off but half but I got us look of us God wanted to press get that get more habo get with dust wet but get with first spadest but it stayed bist the boots wolf but it's bist more bist it would get but it the looks because The bell had hung in its tower for 40 years afterward, and by all ordinary assessments had functioned adequately. Vorn had known, from the moment he heard it rung at its installation, that something had died inside it at the ford. He had never forgotten the sound of that death. He had never again allowed a bell of his to be transported without arrangements of his own specification. The 7 wagons were built to his design by a carpenter in the town, heavy-framed, low-centered, with suspension beds of layered wool, fleece and horsehair, packed into wooden cradles that held each bell in a specific orientation determined by its weight distribution, its profile geometry, and the anticipated characteristics of the roads between the foundry and Verenthis. The great bell required its own wagon, pulled by 6 oxen and accompanied at all times by at least 2 of the 8 men hired specifically for the transport, whose sole responsibility was to walk alongside and ensure that the bell's cradle maintained its orientation on slopes and during the river crossings that the route required. Vorn walked the entire distance on foot, which was not strictly necessary, but which was for him something between professional duty and personal ritual. He had walked to every installation of his Burgeld. In the Stange Stadicate, you had to stay at his Ivicate, stay at Cates, staying within a Yid Shoats, divericating with, istinging with, listenings with spinning sip with sinspip within for set in exit sip with whips at that with that with the fart with will with and that's a well we also have with whip with the heck with pet tap bad but akbuka wow gak whoop off my that pauskag with a speculate this was gorgast lots go pick up bit messages as grasp with then with Izara walked with him, partly for the same reason, and partly because she understood, by this point in their collaboration, that Vorn during the installation phase of a commission was a man who needed a companion without needing conversation, and she was, by natural disposition, exactly the right companion for this, present, attentive, and comfortable with extended silence. The journey generated its own mythology before it was finished, in the way that unusual processions through rural landscapes always do. The villagers along the route had, in most cases, never seen bells being transported. Bells, once installed, do not travel, and the combination of the wagon's size, the evident value of their cargo, the number of oxen required, and the quality of the bronze visible through the fleece wrappings, when the wind disturbed them, produced a complex local response that moved through the registers of wonder, reverence, suspicion, and festivity as they passed from one community to the next. Children ran alongside for miles. A priest in one village blessed the procession with a formality that suggested he had prepared a blessing in advance on the basis of rumor. An old woman at the roadside in a hamlet, whose name no one later recorded, reached out as the great bell's wagon passed and pressed her open palm against the fleece-covered flank for a moment, eyes closed, face still, the gesture of someone making contact with something they have been waiting for. Isra recorded this in her journal, not as a curiosity but as data, evidence of the kind of relationship that the people of this landscape already had with bells. The way bells occupied not just the acoustic but the emotional and spiritual geography of communities that had never examined that relationship and did not need to in order to not need to and not need to and not need to and not to not know to mad with sepines so not to inspat to senat with to senect with its again at a subwit to at with that and with that with the to at poo with will about it with where at slip with how quit up with where poor what that with that map up at the hope at scarf at a path was cap up at pasqua map house at pescadist was what worth with a gust with what befest with the cathedral at Verenthis was, when they arrived, in the last phase of its construction, a state that in the 12th century meant simultaneous presence of completion and incompletion in proportions that would alarm a modern observer, but that were entirely normal to the era. The south transept was roofed, but its windows not yet glazed, admitting a diagonal shaft of spring afternoon light that fell across the unfinished floor with the beauty of an accident. The nave was complete and already in liturgical use, its stones still raw-smelling, the mortar between the courses not yet fully cured to the grey-white of settled masonry, but still showing the darker tones of recent application. The tower was finished, had been finished for a year, waiting for its purpose, and it was the tower that Vorn went to first, before the bells were unloaded, before he greeted the bishop or acknowledged the formalities of arrival. He simply went to the tower and climbed it. He climbed all the way to the bell chamber, which was empty and waiting, its louvered openings cut at the orientations he had specified in correspondence 2 years earlier, its floor cleared of construction debris and swept to the clean stone beneath. He stood in the center of the space for a long time, turning slowly, not looking at the louvers or the floor, or the structural elements, but listening to the acoustic signature of the empty room, the way sound moved and reflected in its specific dimensions and proportions, the way the stone absorbed and returned energy at different frequencies. Every space has an acoustic signature, and every space's signature shapes the character of any sound produced within it. The bell chamber of a cathedral tower is not merely a housing for bells, it is an acoustic instrument in its own right, and the bells that hang in it do not simply produce their designed sounds into neutral air. They produce those sounds into a space that has its own resonant properties, its own preferred frequencies, its own way of augmenting certain characteristics and diminishing others. Vorn had accounted for this in his designs, had, in fact, requested specific chamber dimensions and louver angles precisely because of their acoustic implications. But there is a difference between designing for a space described on paper and standing in the space itself, and the difference requires a physical reckoning that no amount of calculation can substitute for. When he came down, he said to Isara, who had been waiting in the courtyard with the kind of patience that had become over 2 years, simply the baseline condition of working with him, "The chamber is good, better than I expected. The stone course at the east wall has a resonance at approximately the nominal of the third bell. We will need to account for that." He said this the way he said everything technical, as a fact, established rather than a problem encountered. Isara wrote it down. They went to find the bishop. The rigging of the bells took 12 days. In this era, bell hanging was specialized work performed by craftsmen who traveled between cathedrals and abbeys as their commissions required, and the team at Verenthis, 6 men under a master rigger named Clot, who had hung bells in 9 cathedrals and was generally acknowledged to be the best in the region, were competent, experienced, and accustomed to founders who delivered their bells and departed. They were not accustomed to a founder who remained, who climbed into the bell chamber on the first morning and did not leave it for the duration of the hanging, who intervened at specific moments to adjust the placement of a headstock by fractions of an inch or two, request a different configuration for the crown staple that secured a clapper. Clot accommodated Vorn's interventions with a professional neutrality that Isara, observing from the chamber floor, read as the specific neutrality of a skilled man who recognizes in another skilled man a competence that is different from but not lesser than it's different from but not lesser than it is different. In its denfens fictionens but sinnes for senfens, can hulis senfenisilaben who is insistence in it with it feminine, simit pensifinic, sikic sifafru kinnic band, with when, with amen with them, and in separate foot but with good with fata, with kick with whoop at meva, with that with ha, pata, but with safa, papa, quack, west, with death, the cock, if it's about half could be custom to see, but it's that cat up is go at with its Vorn was not being fussy. Every adjustment he requested was the product of calculation. The precise height of each bell's pivot point relative to its neighbors determined the phase relationship of their swings during ringing sequences, which in turn affected the temporal relationships between their strikes and therefore the emergence of the superpulse he had designed. The angle of each clapper's rest position determined the geometry of its arc during ringing, and therefore the precise location on the soundbow where it would strike, which affected which partial tones received the greatest initial excitation. These were not preferences, they were parameters, and each parameter had a correct value, and the correct value had been calculated, and the calculation needed to be implemented in the physical hanging with the same precision that had gone into every other aspect of the work. He spent the most time, nearly 2 full days, on the hanging of the great bell, whose mass and the complex dynamics of whose swing required the most careful configuration of headstock, gudgeons, and crown staple to achieve the clapper strike geometry he had designed. When it was finally settled to his satisfaction, he stood on the chamber floor and looked up at the great bell hanging above him in its frame, and said nothing, which Isara had come to understand was his most complete form of approval. On the morning of the first full ring, 2 days before the consecration ceremony, the cathedral was empty of everyone except the ringers, Vorn, Izara, and the master Riggerclod, who had asked to be present out of a professional interest that he did not elaborate and did not need to. The ringers, 8 local men who had been trained in change-ringing methods and had spent the previous 3 evenings learning the specific sequences that Vorn had composed to demonstrate the ring's capabilities, took their positions. In the ringing chamber below the bell chamber, each holding the tail of a bell rope. It was early morning. The light through the unglazed south transept windows was the flat gragold of a spring dawn, still deciding what kind of day it would be. The stone of the cathedral was cold, as cathedral stone always is in the early morning, radiating the accumulated chill of the night hours, with the equanimity of material that has no investment in temperature, and never will. Vorn stood at the foot of the stairs to the bell chamber, where he could hear both the bells above and the ringers below. Izara stood in the center of the nave, at the crossing, which she had identified during her preliminary acoustic assessment of the space as the point at which the combined sound of the ring would arrive, with the most favorable balance of direct sound from the bells and reflected sound from the stone surfaces. She held her recording materials. She had not slept well. She admitted to herself, nervous in a way that had nothing to do with fear of failure and everything to do with the possibility of something extraordinary, the recognition that she was about to hear something that no one had ever heard before, and that she might not be adequate to the hearing of it, that her ears and her notation and her concepts might not be sufficient for what was about to arrive. The first bell spoke, the second followed, the third, fourth, fifth, and then all 7 were in motion, the ring unfolding into the stone space of the nave with a physical authority that went beyond sound into something like weather, like a front of pressure moving through the air, reorganizing the acoustic environment of the cathedral from silence to an inhabited, structured fullness that felt, even to the pragmatic and technically oriented mind of Izara, of the Mill District, like a kind of argument being made at volume. The individual tones were distinct and clear, each bell's voice identifiable in the complex weave, their harmonic relationships audible as the specific quality of rightness that well-tuned intervals always have. The absence of beats, the sense of resolution, the seem to occupy space, the sense of race of the sense of excellence of less, sense of lessons, and those sense of cells, sense of comfortably, and those sense of those though there is low session with though as though as and with the says when with other with the with that if to come in with was at up back with a got that ma pocket hack back where back us that got voice bow that it's the mathematical design of the ring's tuning was working. That was the first thing she heard and confirmed. The 7 bells were together what each one was separately, their voices supporting rather than obscuring each other. The combined sound larger and more complex than any single voice, but coherent rather than confused. Then she found the pulse. Not the individual pulses of the 7 bells, she had heard those in isolation, had mapped them and documented them and understood their character. The superpulse, the pattern that existed in the interference between all 7 voices simultaneously. The rhythm that Vorn had calculated, and she had argued about, and they had together designed into the proportional relationships between the 7 profiles over the long winter of the calculations. She found it the way you find a face in a crowd when you know who you are looking for. Suddenly, completely, with the specific quality of recognition that is also a kind of arrest, a moment in which the perceptual field reorganizes around the found thing and everything else becomes context. It was there, beating at 3 cycles per second, just as they had designed, just as the argument had resolved, not so fast as to be roughness, not so slow as to be intermittent, but a continuous, living, deliberate rhythm in the stone space of a cathedral within the stone space of a stained, composite sound of stavels, and together it is spendvus, spadral, spadris, spethens, Bentry, and Spadian, Bissos, Bid, Spat, Crispicis, Papinic, in Bow, with Ripripperag, with that, with Pep, with Menace, with work, that Magnic, with Gag, with Papa, with the Pap, ya, Bucket, where Appa, with that, as after what Epa, Spore of look, the Aha, that over wood, bout, at Spoke, Akakalo, Akadaft, soft words, spoke, Okus, Gove, what's Boist, Agal, what's this, Nussets, Goth, it's She stood at the crossing of Verenthis Cathedral and listened to a rhythm made of mathematics, cast into bronze, suspended in stone, and released into morning air, and understood that she was hearing something that had never existed before, and that had been, in a very precise sense, inevitable, that the world had always contained this sound, waiting in the relationship between geometry and acoustics and human perception, and that Vorn had found it the way mathematicians find things, not by inventing them, but by following the logic to where they were already sitting, patient and exact, requiring only the right question to become audible. The ringing lasted 40 minutes. When it ended, the silence was not the silence before the bells, but a different silence, a silence shaped by what had just inhabited it, carrying the memory of the sound the way a room carries the warmth of a fire after the fire is out. Clot, the master rigger, stood in the doorway of the ringing chamber, with an expression that suggested he was revising an opinion he had not known he held. Vorn was at the foot of the tower stairs, eyes closed, hands at his sides, exactly as still as one of the bells at rest. Izara did not write anything for several minutes. Then she wrote one sentence and read it back to herself and found it adequate. The superpulse sounds at 3 cycles per second, exactly as calculated, and is perceptible from the crossing of the nave, without special training or prior instruction, which means that any person who stands in this cathedral when all 7 bells ring together will hear, below the level of analysis and above the level of ignorance, a rhythm made not by any human hand, but by the relationship between 7 mathematical forms. This is what was intended. It is accomplished. Chapter 8. Dissonance. Beauty, when it is sufficiently complex, has always produced in some of its witnesses not admiration but unease, and the Verenthis bells were no exception to this rule. The consecration ceremony took place for days after the first full ring, attended by the bishop, his chapter of canons and subordinate clergy, representatives of the secular nobility who had contributed to the cathedral's funding, and a congregation of townspeople and villagers from the surrounding valley, who had, in many cases, been listening to the bells from their homes and fields for the past 3 days, and had come to the ceremony, carrying in their bodies the physical memory of a sound that was unlike any they had previously experienced. The bishop, a wealth-travelled and intellectually confident man named Aldrich, who had studied at Paris, and was not easily impressed by things that could be understood, declared the bells magnificent in his opening remarks, with a directness and warmth that Izara recorded as entirely genuine. He had stood in the bell chamber during the first full ring, and had felt the sound in his sternum and the soles of his feet, and had made, she thought, exactly the right assessment. This is extraordinary, and I do not need to understand it fully in order to know that it is extraordinary. 3 of his subordinate canons did not share this equanimity. Their objections, which reached Vorn in the days following the consecration through the reliable transmission network of ecclesiastical gossip, were each specific and each illuminating in its specificity. The first canon, a theologian of conservative formation named Brother Petrus, whose intellectual framework had been built on the principle that religious experience should be accessible to the unlearned and should not require specialized training or unusual perceptual gifts, found the bell's complexity troubling in a doctrinal sense. The sound, he argued, was too complicated for prayer. Prayer required a clear and unobstructed passage between the human soul and the divine, and a sound that demanded this much attention to navigate. A sound that had too many things happening in it, that offered too many layers for the mind to settle in, created interference where there should be transparency. The bells, in his view, were performing rather than serving, and performance was a form of pride that the church had reason to be suspicious of. He had, in private correspondence that was not intended to reach Vorn but did, used the word hubris. The second canon's objection was more specific and, in a way, more perceptive. He was a man of mathematical education, a former student of natural philosophy, who had spent years working with proportions and ratios in an architectural context, and what disturbed him was not that the bells were too complex, but that they were too precise. He could hear without being able to name what he was hearing, that the relationships between the bells were not the product of traditional practice, refined over time, but the product of deliberate calculation. The sound felt, he said, in his reported objection, like being measured, like standing in the presence of something that was assessing you, rather than addressing you. He did not think this feeling was wrong. Exactly. He thought it was uncomfortable in a way that he could not fully justify, and that discomfort in the presence of religious architecture was, in his experience, a signal worth taking seriously. He had described this unease to the bishop in a private meeting, and the bishop had listened with the patience of a man who respects intelligence even when it arrives at uncomfortable conclusions, and had then said, with characteristic directness, "The bells are measuring the relationship between geometry and God. This has always been the project of cathedral architecture. The canon has simply heard it for the first time in sound." The canon had found this answer both satisfying and insufficient, which was, Izara thought when she heard it, exactly the right response to it. The third canon's complaint was the most pragmatic and Vorn's judgment when it was reported to him, the most worth taking seriously. He simply said that the bells reminded him of mathematics, and that he found mathematics, in a religious context, cold. The cathedral was a place of warmth, spiritual warmth, human warmth, the warmth of community gathered under a shared transcendence. Mathematics was not warm. It was exact and indifferent and eternal in the specific way of things that do not know you are there. He did not want to pray in a space whose primary acoustic feature was a reminder of his own smallness relative to an impersonal order. Vorn sat with these objections for 2 days before responding to any of them, which was longer than Izara expected, and told her that he was taking them more seriously than he would admit directly. When he finally spoke about them, he did not defend his work in the way she anticipated. He did not argue that the canons were wrong or poorly equipped to judge. He said, "Petros is right that the sound demands attention. He is wrong that attention interferes with prayer. The bells ask you to listen well. This is the same thing the Psalms ask. The second canon has heard the calculation in the sound and found it uncomfortable. I have no remedy for this. The calculation is there and it is not going anywhere. But discomfort in the presence of precision is a problem of expectation, not of precision. The third," he paused. "The third is the hardest. He says the mathematics is cold. He may be right. I have spent 30 years with mathematics, and I do not find it cold, but I have 30 years of intimacy with it, and he does not. The question he is asking is whether the warmth of the congregation can inhabit a space that has been made to resound with something impersonal. I believe it can. I believe the congregation brings the warmth, and the bells provide the form that holds it. But I am a founder, not a priest, and this is not my question to answer definitively." He paused again, longer this time. "What I know is that I made what was true. Whether what is true serves the place is not a question the maker can resolve alone. That resolution happens over time, between the place and the people who inhabit it. We will not know the answer for a generation." This turned out to be exactly correct, though in ways neither of them could have predicted. The discomfort of the canons faded within a year, overcome by the experience of the congregation, by the observable fact that the people of Verenthis and the surrounding valley did not find the bells cold or demanding or inappropriately precise. They found them, in the language available to people who had never studied acoustics or campanology and never would, simply right. The bells sounded like a cathedral sounded. They sounded like what this place, which the community had been building and waiting for and anticipating for a decade, was supposed to sound like. The rightness was not analyzed. It was felt, and feeling, as the third canon might have acknowledged if he had been inclined to reconsider, is the form that warmth takes when mathematics has done its work correctly. The physical dissonance, the practical problem of the tower resonances, was another matter, requiring not philosophical reconciliation but engineering diagnosis. In the weeks after the consecration, the ringers reported that in certain change sequences, the tower itself seemed to join the ringing. Specific sections of the masonry, particularly in the upper reaches of the bell chamber walls, produced a perceptible vibration during certain combinations of bells that went beyond the normal sympathetic resonance one expected stone to exhibit in the presence of powerful acoustic energy. It was not destructive. The mortar joints showed no signs of stress. The stone courses were intact, but it was alarming to those who felt it, particularly because it was not constant but intermittent, emerging in some sequences and absent in others, appearing and disappearing in a pattern that the ringers could not predict, and that gave rise, with the efficiency with which rural communities in the 12th century generated supernatural explanations for mechanical phenomena they did not understand, to the rumor that the bells were visited by presences that made themselves known through the stones. Vorn returned to Verenthis in late summer to investigate. He spent a week in systematic work that Izara, who accompanied him, described in her notes as the most purely diagnostic she had ever watched him perform. Patient, methodical, unemotional, entirely organized around the question of what was happening rather than what it meant. He visited every accessible section of the tower with a tuning fork and a stick of chalk, striking surfaces and marking the ones that responded with sympathetic resonance, mapping the distribution of the tower's own resonant frequencies across its structure. The work was physically demanding and spatially awkward. Many of the sections he needed to reach required climbing along scaffolding ledges and squeezing through access apertures that had been designed for construction workers half his age, but he completed it without complaint and without rest of more than the minimum necessary. Because he was in the grip of a question, and questions of this kind did not release him until he had an answer. The answer, when it emerged from the mapping, stopped him in the middle of the bell chamber with the specific quality of arrest that genuine surprise produces in people who have disciplined themselves against it. He stood with his chalk in one hand and his tuning fork in the other, and looked at what his marks on the stone told him. And then he looked at his drawings of the bell profiles, and then he looked at the marks again. And then he sat down on the chamber floor, not on a bucket this time, but directly on the stone, because there was no bucket available, and his legs had decided without consulting him that this was a moment for sitting and work through the mathematics in his head for approximately 10 minutes before saying, to Isara, who was crouching nearby, watching him with the attentive stillness she had learned was required when he was in this state, "The tower is in tune with the ring." She waited. The resonant frequencies of the masonry, the sections that are responding to the bells, are not random. They are not coincidental structural properties of the building materials. They correspond to partial tones of the ring that are not among the principal 5 of any individual bell, but that arise in the composite sound when specific combinations of bells are rung simultaneously. The combinations that produce the tower resonances are the combinations in which those composite partials are strongest. The tower is responding to the sound of the ring. Because it was built, he built it, to respond to the sound of this ring. The architectural proportions of the chamber, the dimensions of the walls, the specific thickness and composition of the stone courses, they produce resonant frequencies that fall, not by accident, but by design, into the gaps in the ring's overtone structure. The ring and the tower are a single acoustic instrument. He designed both. She knew who he referred to without clarification, the master builder of the tower, a master builder of the tower's construction records, a mason named Endeavor's construction records, a mason named Gable's contractions, a mason in it. Meeste mentioned in its convention pension by mentioned in expansion of it bin impspensend bin comprenskens complenksen sixkinspakingsen ben cliprent ben and with that we are where book and it without at how was I was with hooped with will put boop me pack a cat asahak hoofback pekathat oh attack a work gag but oh cat if the west discuss go that it moves this task of this gives Vorn had designed the bells for the tower. He had also, through that correspondence, helped design the tower for the bells. She had not known this. He had not told her. He had not mentioned it now. She had simply followed the evidence to the conclusion. "You designed the tower," she said. "I made suggestions," said Vorn. "The tower is part of the instrument." "The tower was always going to be part of the instrument," he said. "The only question was whether the part it played would be designed or accidental. I preferred designed." She looked at him for a moment. Then she wrote in her notebook, "He did not build 7 bells and a tower. He built one instrument in 8 parts, the 8th being stone. I wonder how many more parts he considered and did not mention." Chapter 9. The Equation of Return. Aurelius Vorn lived to be 71 years old, a lifespan that placed him, in the actuarial tables of the 12th century, firmly in the category of the exceptionally fortunate, and one that he occupied with the same deliberateness he brought to everything else. Not wasting the late years on diminishment or nostalgia, but using them with the focused intensity of someone who has a specific quantity of work left to do, and a specific quantity of time in which to do it, and understands that the relationship between these two quantities is not one he controls. He continued to found bells until his 68th year, when the arthritis in his hands became severe enough that he could no longer feel what he needed to feel in the bronze to be confident of his work, and confidence, for him, was not a psychological state, but a technical standard, the point at which the empirical evidence was sufficient to justify committing to the final form. When the arthritis took his fingers' sensitivity below that threshold, he stopped. not dramatically or with expressial integrity. The work requirity of possession petigrity, and motiquarities, it is matically of metigri. It would matter a quora to work required, with worquara quora, in quorum. And we're king with quinning with corkings poxipuli, when will get it was a quick in it quick quail with wicket, why, with so power with a counter, good with walk, with to have a bow sour, up with our up with our heart, with walk hours are that off curse, calf till a spores, or coward, or have to tip In the final 3 years of his life he wrote, and received visitors, and continued to think about bells, not in the practical sense of designing specific instruments, but in the theoretical sense of trying to complete the intellectual architecture, of which the Verenthis ring was the most advanced practical expression. He received, during those years, craftsmen from England, the Low Countries, the German-speaking lands, and from as far as northern Italy, men who had heard, through the specialized networks of their trade, that the bells at Verenthis were different in ways that mattered, and who had made pilgrimages to listen, and had come away with observations they wanted to understand. He received them in his workshop, which by this point was more archive than foundry, its furnace cold, its walls still papered in the accumulated diagrams of a career that had concluded its practical phase, that surprised Ira, who had expected more of the privacy and completeness, that surprised Isera, who had expected more of the privacy so escated, who had expectorized Brictorate, expectorite, cactorexcti, expectact, cactorisecti, excipit, cag, surub, xap, benwitgren, cuckgaup, about to with specbat, with quiset, with wolfgat, metsk, with papk, waft, with pat, hapa, was hukul, but it's kappa at was if I works go at the was group got was he shared everything: the profile calculations, the alloy specifications, the clapper design principles, the mathematical framework for predicting partial tone relationships from geometric parameters. He showed visitors his notebooks and encouraged them to copy what they needed. He explained the theory of pulsatio geometrica with the same patient clarity he had used when explaining it to Isora 2 decades earlier, walking through the mathematics step by step, demonstrating with test castings how the interference between correctly proportioned partials generated the beat frequencies that produced the pulse. He concealed nothing and simplified nothing, and made no attempt to present his methods as more mysterious or inaccessible than they were. The knowledge was available. Anyone who wanted it could have it. None of the visitors, in the years of Vorn's late life, or the decades that followed, produced work that replicated what he had achieved. The Verenthis bells remained, in Isra's experience of the broader campanological world, unique, not in the sense that no one else made excellent bells, but in the specific sense that no one else made bells whose pulsations geometricae were both present and musically integrated, and acoustically durable and proportionally coherent with each other, in the way Vorn's were. The gap between what he taught and what his students produced was not the gap of withheld knowledge, but of untransmittable capacity, and this distinction was one he understood clearly and expressed in one of his last letters, with characteristic precision. "I have given them the equations," he wrote to Isera, who was by then established in her own career as a bell assessor and acoustic consultant of considerable reputation. "What I cannot give them is the 30 years of listening that tell you which solution to the equation is the right one when mathematics alone cannot distinguish between them. The equations are necessary but not sufficient. The insufficiency is the work of a lifetime, and lifetimes are not portable." This was the frustration and the consolation of his legacy, and he appeared to hold both without particular bitterness or particular satisfaction. The frustration being that the thing he had spent his life building could not be straightforwardly transmitted and would not produce a lineage of comparable work. The consolation being that the bells themselves were permanent, that the bronze, which did not corrode at meaningful rates over the timescales of human civilization, would carry the work forward for as long as cathedrals stood and people stood inside them. He had not made knowledge that would persist. He had made objects that would persist. The knowledge was encoded in the objects, available to anyone who could read it, waiting for a reader with sufficient ears, or, in later centuries, sufficient instruments. Izara, for her part, spent the decades after the Verenthis Commission in work that was partly practical. She assessed bells for installation across a wide regional territory and was regarded by the founders and patrons she worked with as the most reliable acoustic evaluator of her era, and partly intellectual, completing and extending the documentation of Vorn's methods that she had begun during their collaboration. The treatise she assembled from his notebooks and her own records was a genuine work of synthesis, not a manual but a theory, organized around the principle that bell acoustics was a branch of applied mathematics, and that the mathematics was, in principle, complete, that there was nothing in the acoustic behavior of bronze bells that was not, in principle, calculable from geometric first principles, and that the remaining obstacles to doing so were not theoretical but practical, arising from the complexity of the calculation and the limitations of the measuring instruments available. She was right, and the rightness of her conclusion was demonstrated 600 years later, when Marta Solberg walked into the bell chamber at Verenthis, with instruments that had taken the intervening centuries to develop, and found that the calculations were exactly as the manuscript predicted. The treatise circulated in partial manuscript form during the century after its completion, reaching a small but appreciative audience of technically minded monks, cathedral architects, and natural philosophers who recognized in it a quality of thinking that was unusual for its era: organized, empirical, mathematical, self-conscious about the relationship between theory and observation, in a way that anticipated the scientific methodology that European intellectual culture would not formally develop for another 4 centuries. It did not, however, survive intact into the print era. The copies dispersed, were incorporated into other manuscripts without attribution, were absorbed into the broader stream of European technical literature in the piecemeal, anonymous way that medieval knowledge transmission worked. By the 16th century, the treatise as a unified document no longer existed in any repository that anyone had catalogued. What survived were fragments, a section on alloy composition here, a series of profile calculations there, a discussion of clapper design preserved in an appendix to a wholly unrelated manuscript on church furnishings. The synthesis was lost, even if the pieces were not, and without the synthesis the pieces did not speak. Vorn died in January of a year that the surviving records give ambiguously, either 1192 or 1194. The discrepancy arising from a damaged date in the parish record of the town where he had lived and worked for 40 years. He died in his workshop, which was appropriate, and he died without visible anxiety, which Izara, who was present, recorded as consistent with his general character. He had lived in close relationship with making things well, and things that had been made well persisted, and persistence was a form of argument that did not require the maker's continued presence to continue making. He had said what he had to say in bronze. The bronze was still saying it. He could stop. Chapter X. When the earth listened, 853 years after the consecration of the Verenthis bells, a woman named Marta Solberg arrived at what remained of the cathedral town on a Thursday morning in early October, driving a rented car loaded with equipment whose combined cost exceeded the annual income of the entire Verenthis Valley in Vorn's era. She had come from Copenhagen via Frankfurt, where she had delivered a paper on the acoustic properties of pre-industrial bronze alloys to an audience of 40 specialists who had asked, between them, 112 questions, of which she had answered approximately 80 and deferred the remainder to ongoing research. She was 43 years old, the holder of a chair in architectural acoustics at a Danish university, the author of 4 books and 37 peer-reviewed papers, and the possessor of, by the assessment of her field, the best ear for bell acoustics currently active in European scholarship. She had been trying to get to Verenthis for 3 years, delayed successively by funding cycles, a pandemic, 2 other fieldwork commitments, and the protracted bureaucratic negotiation required to obtain permission to operate measurement in a functioning heritage religious site. She was not a patient person by disposition, but she was a persistent one, which in her experience was more useful. The cathedral was still there, but only partially itself. The nave and tower were original 12th century construction, patched and reinforced over the centuries but structurally intact. The same stone that Vorn had stood in, the same proportions that Dervis the mason had built under his acoustic direction. The south transept was a 17th century replacement, its style a mismatch with the older fabric that the townspeople had long since stopped seeing, because familiarity makes mismatches invisible. The east end of the choir had been rebuilt twice. The louvered openings in the bell tower were not original. The current louvers were 18th century replacements installed after a storm damage repair, but their positions were, as Solberg confirmed from a comparison of the current structure with the original construction drawings she had located in the cathedral archive, substantially identical to the positions Vorn had specified. Spentially identical, spentially spantical as spentically spentially, spentia station spench of spench bella spinsel specis spensix sixpins spell and workso and rip soak to and resa to a power domin of that with it with this pix with wet back with commits that put wet app the geometry of the sound path was preserved, even if the specific timbre was not. The bells were the reason for her visit. Of the 7 original Vorn castings, 3 had survived the centuries intact. The great bell, now called dialta, bearing a worn inscription that was no longer legible but whose date, established by dendrochronological dating of the wooden headstock material and by metallurgical analysis of the alloy, was consistent with the 12th century casting, and 2 of the smaller bells, the 4th and 6th in the original ring, which had escaped the 18th century recastings that had replaced the other 4 with technically competent but acoustically conventional instruments. The 3 surviving Vorn bells were recognized as historically significant and had been treated as heritage objects for the past century, examined, photographed, documented in the standard campanological literature, but no one had subjected them to the kind of detailed acoustic analysis that Solberg's instruments made possible. She set up her equipment over 2 days, calibrating her microphones and spectrometer against known reference sources, establishing measurement protocols that would allow her to compare the acoustic signatures of the 3 Vorn bells with those of the 4 18th century replacements, and with an extensive database of pre-industrial bell recordings she had accumulated over 15 years of fieldwork. On the morning of the 3rd day she began her measurements, starting with the smallest of the Vorn survivors and working up to dialta, taking each bell through a systematic series of strikes at precisely controlled energy levels, using a calibrated instrumented hammer of her own design that allowed her to specify the impact force to within 1%. She recorded at 9 microphone positions in the bell chamber and at 5 additional positions in the nave, correlating the measurements to build a 3-dimensional model of each bell's acoustic behavior across the space. The data from the 3 Vorn bells separated itself from the data of the 4 replacement bells immediately. In the first hour of analysis, as clearly as handwriting separates an individual from their contemporaries, not in any single measurement, but in the collective character of the measurement set, in the way the profile of acoustic properties fit together into a pattern that was, in the 3 Vorn bells, structurally coherent, and, in the 4 replacements, merely technically adequate. The replacement bells were good bells by conventional standards. Their principal partial tones were correctly tuned. Their alloy composition was appropriate, their surface condition was good, but their acoustic profiles were the profiles of instruments designed individually, without reference to a system, without the deeper structural intention that, in the Vorn bells, made every acoustic parameter an expression of a single underlying principle rather than a collection of independently optimized variables. The pulsatio geometrica emerged from the data on the first day, exactly where Isera had described it, and exactly as Vorn's calculations predicted. It appeared in the spectrographic analysis as a low-frequency amplitude modulation of the composite tone, a rhythmic variation in the overall loudness of the bell's sound at a frequency of approximately 1.8 cycles per second for the small surviving bell, 2.1 for the 4th, and 3.0 for dialta. The modulation was generated by the interference between pairs of partial tones whose frequency difference equaled the modulation rate, and the specific partial pairs responsible were, in each case, the pairs whose ratio relationship Vorn had calculated to produce this exact result. The mathematics was visible in the physics. The physics was audible in the sound. Solberg verified audibility by playing recordings to 23 blind-tested subjects. Graduate students, colleagues, and several members of the cathedral's congregation recruited for the purpose, and asking them to describe what they heard. 19 of the 23 reported perceiving a rhythm, a pulse, a breathing quality, or a sense of animation in the sound of the Vorn bells that was absent from the replacements. 4 did not, and Solberg recorded this as significant. The pulse was perceptible but not universal, which was consistent with Isra's historical report that it required attentive listening even if it did not require specialized training. The subject responses were what stayed with Solberg longest in the weeks after the fieldwork. After the data was organized, and the statistical analysis was complete, and the paper was drafted, and the peer review process was underway, the subject's language was remarkably consistent across a group that shared no prior conversation about the bells and had been tested individually. They said, breathing, counting, something alive inside the sound. One subject, a music teacher in her 50s, had pressed her lips together after listening for a moment and said, "It sounds like it knows you are there." Solberg had written this in her field notes and then sat for a moment and looked at what she had written and thought about a founder working by a river in the 12th century, in a workshop without electricity or spectrometers or calibrated hammers, or caltering between, in a spectroment, descending, dividing, disarming, descending, spending, this quality of militarity of ministry, and in the sounding of descending, tendis, the tending a kending, this spicicans, persenskensquisament set, this sissens spicicap sissext with it, insikin de ken me sank and walk up in McKen and with sell gapello with pillow get sap bill soft with soak with hortis that with a back with poor but what I whip sa gave it pasa hawka hawk bow sa gawas akta or goes with how we call a car skip me walk spark wood can do I find states of pursue with go with this word the workers that was she thought he would have understood exactly what she meant. He would have said, in his precise and economical way, "Yes, that is what the geometry is for." Chapter 11. The Bell That Would Not Ring. The letter is undated, though contextual evidence in its contents places its composition in or around 1178, approximately 30 years after the completion of the Verenthis Commission, and roughly 3 years before Vorn's death. It was written by Isara to a student of hers in Lyon named Gerard, a young man she had been advising in his early career as a bell assessor, who had written to her asking for guidance on a specific problem of partial tone tuning in a ring he was evaluating. Her reply addressed his technical question in its first 2 pages with the directness and precision that characterized all her professional correspondence. In the third and final page, she turned personal, with an abruptness that suggests she had not planned to when she began writing, and that something in the act of thinking about partial tones and proportional ratios had brought a memory forward that demanded to be written. She wrote what she wrote. She told Gerard, because she was old enough now, she was in her mid-60s by this point, which was very old for the era, and she knew it to be past the obligation of restraint that had governed her professional writing. She had spent 30 years recording and transmitting Vorn's work as accurately as she could. What she had not recorded, because she had not known how to place it in the framework of a technical document, was this: in the last 2 years of his active career, before the arthritis made the direct work impossible, Vorn had been designing a bell that he never intended to build. Or rather, she corrected herself, because precision in language was as important to her as precision in measurement. He was trying to design a bell that he could not yet build, and was perhaps trying to understand what it would mean to build it, which was not the same thing. He had not spoken to her about it directly. She had known about it because she had, by that stage of their relationship, the ability to read the direction of his attention from his behavior, from which notebooks he reached for in the evenings, from the particular quality of absorption that characterized his work on the drawings she was not invited to look at, from the occasional half-sentence that surfaced in their conversations and was then withdrawn. Not with evasion, but with the specific withdrawal of someone who does not yet trust a thought enough to give it to another mind. She had gone through his papers after his death, as his literary executor, and as the person most qualified to determine which documents deserved preservation and which were working waste. She had found a wooden box that she recognized as his personal archive, distinct from the professional notebooks that formed the main body of his records. 27 profile drawings of a bell that had never been cast, and that was unlike any bell he had actually made. Unlike in a specific way, the profile curves were recognizable as Vorn's work in their precision and mathematical intentionality. but the profile geometry described a bell whose proportional relationships, when she worked through the implied calculations, were designed to produce a pulsatio geometrica at a frequency far lower than anything he had achieved in practice, lower, in fact, than the threshold of conscious rhythmic perception. The pulse frequency she calculated from the drawings, and she checked this calculation 3 times, because she did not want to make an error about something this important, was in the range of once every 3 to 4 seconds. Not 3 cycles per second, as in the Verenthis super pulse, 1 cycle every 3 to 4 seconds. At this frequency, the pulse would not be heard as a rhythm in any normal sense. A human listener could not consciously track a beat of once every 3 to 4 seconds as a tempo. It is too slow for the auditory system to integrate into a pattern that the conscious mind perceives as rhythmic. But it was not, Izara wrote, nothing. Research on the effects of infrasound and very low-frequency sound on human perception and physiology, research that would not be formally conducted until several centuries after her death, but whose conclusions she was groping toward from clinical observation, suggests that amplitude modulations in this frequency range affect the human nervous system in ways that bypass conscious auditory processing. They create states rather than percepts. They do not produce the experience of hearing a rhythm. They produce the experience of being in a particular kind of silence, a silence that is weighted, that has a specific quality of presence, that feels inhabited in a way that ordinary silence does not. This was what Vorn had been trying to make. Not a bell whose pulse you heard, but a bell whose pulse you became. A bell that did not play a rhythm for the listener, but entrained the listener's own physiological rhythms, the slow oscillations of breath and neural activity and postural control that operate below the frequency of conscious attention, to a geometric pattern derived from the proportional mathematics of bronze. A bell that would make people still in the way that cathedrals make people still, not by asking for stillness, not by commanding it, not by providing it as an aesthetic experience, but by simply and physically inducing it, the way a rocking ship induces sleep in a tired sailor, through a direct mechanical conversation between the world's rhythm and the body's. He wanted, in other words, to put the experience of being inside a cathedral into the bell's voice itself, to make the bronze speak, not to the ear but to the nervous system, to use geometry to do what architecture did, through the medium of air rather than stone. She did not know she was clear about this in her letter to Gerard, who must have read this page with the expression of someone encountering a document from a dimension adjacent to the one they inhabit. Whether Vorn had believed this was possible, or had been pursuing it as a theoretical exercise, a limit case of his methods, a way of thinking through the implications of his own system to their furthest extension. She suspected, knowing him, that the distinction between belief and theoretical exploration was less important to him than the distinction between correct and incorrect, that he was not asking whether such a bell could be made, but asking what the mathematics required if one were to try, and letting the mathematics answer, and recording the answer in 27 increasingly refined profile drawings. The fact that none of the 27 were completed, that each one stopped at a certain point in the derivation with a mark or a question that indicated an unresolved problem, suggested that he had not found the full solution before suggested that he had not found the suggested belted it, suggested bivalus suggested but it fiat, it, and sense again it that. And as we can win and way out and way if it will if we with as we can but I would have you or perhaps before something else ended it, the question of whether the mathematics admitted a solution, or whether the system he had built over 30 years, however extraordinary its achievements, had a boundary at this particular point, a place where what he wanted the geometry to say, and what the geometry could say parted company, and could not be reconciled. The note he had pinned above his drawing table was still there when she cleaned the workshop, a small piece of parchment whose edges had curled with age, and whose ink had faded to a brownish grey that required a good light to read. It said, "What is the shape of the silence between heartbeats?" Below it, in different ink, applied at a different time. "I have not solved this. Perhaps it cannot be solved. Perhaps it can only be approached. She had taken the note and kept it for the rest of her life, and she reproduced it in the letter to Gerard, not because he could help her understand it, but because she wanted it to exist somewhere beyond the single piece of parchment that held it. Wanted it in another mind, in another record, in the ongoing conversation that she had spent her career trying to ensure would continue after both she and Vorn were gone. The 27th drawing, the last one he had made, most refined and most incomplete, was also in the box. She did not describe it to Gerard in technical terms. She said only that it was the drawing of something that had not yet been made, and might never be made, and was, in her judgment, the most important thing Vorn had ever put on paper. Not because it was closer to a solution than the previous 26, but because of the specific point at which it stopped, at the calculation of the pulse frequency, which he had arrived at with more precision than in any previous attempt, and which he had circled in red chalk and written beside, in the largest letters she had ever seen him use, a single Latin word, not hoc. This, as he had written beside the great bell's profile 35 years earlier, something different, something that she translated for Gerard in a parenthesis, because she was not sure Gerard's Latin was up to the register Vorn had used. The word was prepintium, the nearest English rendering, approaching. Chapter the 12th, The Shape That Remains. Marta Solberg returned to Verenthis for the last time in December. Approximately 14 months after the publication of her paper, and approximately 3 weeks after receiving, in the same morning's mail, a prize notification from a Swedish Acoustic Institute, and a letter from an archivist in Aachen who had read the paper in its published form and recognized something. The archivist's letter was 2 pages long and professionally careful in its presentation, but underneath the care Solberg could feel the quality of excitement that archivists permit themselves when they have found something genuinely unusual, the contained structural excitement of people who work with old things and know the difference between old things that are merely rare and old things that are alive. The archivist had found a notebook. The notebook had been in the Aachen collection for 60 years, catalogued under a generic heading that had not attracted specific scholarly attention. It was written in 12th century Latin, in a hand that the archivist had not been able to identify by the standard paleographic tools available. It contained mathematical diagrams and calculations of a specialized technical character that had previously defeated interpretation. After reading Solberg's paper and the profile drawings reproduced in its supplementary materials, the archivist believed she could identify both the hand and the contents. She had attached 3 high-resolution photographs. Was the Frau Professor perhaps familiar with this material? Solberg had been familiar with it within 90 seconds of opening the photographs, before she had read a single word of the text. The profile drawings in the photographs were the profiles of the Verenthis bells, in the hand of the person who had made them, with the specific character of mathematical precision and acoustic intentionality that she had spent 2 years learning to recognize. She had sat at her desk in Copenhagen for approximately 5 minutes, doing nothing but looking at the photographs and feeling the particular quality of professional satisfaction that comes when a long investigation finds its primary source, when the inference chain connects to the origin and the whole structure of your understanding becomes, in that moment, grounded rather than floating. Then she had arranged to go to Aachen, examined the notebook in person, and confirmed the identification beyond reasonable doubt, and taken the train back to Denmark to begin the precising, whether the equation and measurement, whether the calculation of calculation, whether the calculation of calamish with the couch of puel, whether sow with the quesic in the plur, beckas with the akokov, gad, klek with kopek with plur with had, with for with at, with a sat with that, with will with that hack, bath that with sack, to bad, with bob, with hap, with dap, perhaps at, act, as a hacket with that, akas ab with wooka, akat, with kaskaka, sukat, with pat, glue it, maths, gasper, gahak, metal, burger, book, that, the roof, curse, best, med, crest, so word, they matched. She ran the calculations against her measurement data from the October fieldwork, and the margin of error was consistently below 0.5%, which in any scientific context is the difference between interesting coincidence and established fact. The equations in the notebook were the equations of the Verenthis bells. The bells were the physical solutions to the equations. The man who had written the equations 853 years ago in a workshop beside a river had been solving, with a compass and a mind trained to extraordinary precision by 30 years of deliberate practice. the same mathematical problem that she was solving with computers and spectrometers, and his solutions were correct within the tolerance of her instrument's ability to measure them. The notebook contained the nature of the more incres bebessence furve that had launched in, the motresses bessions, what again in itigus, what abended into it pinched of cantrids into the, in its banchident, pritchinits genchus to begin it, the begins cune and sin, and sense it said so as sense it said what says I rent that in work like in it when rel and carret where I pen as how itself we built also how with with that about what we got work with us how about this with this up with to fuck us how walk for but some more I could do this how go more up with laws this what more from the couple of the first schism to listen for tests that is what's the book because the treatise was incomplete, ending mid-sentence in the middle of a chapter on the relationship between partial tone ratios and temporal interference patterns. But the opening line was intact, and she had translated it herself and read it several times before arriving at what she felt was an accurate rendering, and it was the sentence she had written above her desk in Copenhagen, where other people put motivational maxims or family photographs. All geometry is frozen music, and all music is geometry in time. The bell is simply the place where these two facts remember each other. She returned to Verenthis in December, for the reason that was not professionally necessary, and that she did not explain to her department, or her research team when she put the dates in her calendar, because she wanted to stand in the bell chamber with the bell, and be in the same room as the object and the mathematics, simultaneously. After a year of working with the mathematics in isolation, this impulse to close the abstract loop with a physical presence was not something she examined carefully. It was simply there, the way certain needs are simply there, and she had learned over 43 years to trust such needs when they were quiet rather than dramatic, when they were not the needs of performance or validation but of something more fundamental, the need that a person of serious intellectual commitment occasionally has to return from the country of concepts to the country of things and confirm, with her body rather than her mind, that the connection she has been tracing is real. The caretaker was a man of 60-something who had worked at the cathedral for most of his adult life, and who greeted her with the specific warmth of someone who knows a returning visitor without precisely remembering the context of the first visit. She showed him her institutional identification, which he studied with the thoroughness of someone who has learned over decades that thoroughness, in small things, is a sustainable professional practice. And then he led her up the tower stairs with the steady, unhurried pace of someone who has climbed these stairs thousands of times and has long since passed through every register of response to them. The early novelty, the later familiarity, the eventual intimacy into something beyond intimacy that she did not have a precise word for. A relationship between a person and a place, so long that the place has become part of the person's physical understanding of the world. The stairs, so known that climbing them requires no attention and returns the mind to returns the mind to returns the mind, to stay so stave itself, to so and so meant, to it so it, in it, with the puts at, to wicket to pop it, could put with it with us, it's it, to suffok that it's with up, and hap do is that looked, map up with to put up at audit cock at but ask but that the puffs cut up at a papa stuck with tough gay gasps got whist got what's to this we've had it just because there's the bell chamber in December was cold with the specific cold of high enclosed stone spaces in winter, not the wet cold of outdoors but a dry, mineral cold that the stone had been accumulating since October and would hold until April. The cold of a material with very high thermal mass, very slowly releasing what summer had given it. The 3 Vorn bells hung in their frames, di-altar at the chamber's center, the 4th and 6th at its flanks, in the particular stillness of objects that have been doing the same thing for a very long time and have no interest in doing anything else. They were, by any objective assessment, simply large pieces of bronze in a stone room. They were also, by the assessment of the year of work she had put into understanding them, among the most precise physical expressions of a mathematical idea that the pre-modern world had produced, not in spite of having been made by hand, in a workshop, without instruments more sophisticated than a compass and a trained ear, but in some way that she found difficult to articulate precisely, because of it. The precision was intelligent, to the creality, the entire intelligence togetherly, the creative, the precision of intelligent controlled intelligence, and the creative intelligent interitor, the entity together to the territing Barrett, in the crane of a tetraconsequente Ken Pro, the plunica cans candy to Prodware can point where Anxer Kanga with Quillen Whipad Osapa was it was I miss Wahasawa how Capicus Paul with Squawk with Quawa house up but walk up with a power walk to Haka Ataka Kakabaka so there were no redundancies in what Vorn had done. Everything depended on everything else, and everything depended, ultimately, on him. This was not a robust methodology by modern standards. It had produced, in this one instance, something that modern methodology, for all its advantages, had not yet replicated. She asked the caretaker, with a directness that she preferred to elaborate preamble, whether he would be willing to strike dialto once with the wooden maintenance mallet she could see hanging on a hook beside the bell frame. He looked at the mallet, looked at her, and consented without discussion. The consent of someone who has learned that unusual requests from people with institutional identification are usually harmless and occasionally interesting. The strike was clean and correctly placed on the sound bow. The impact energy within the range that her October measurements had used as the standard for comparability. The tone rose into the chamber air with the authority she had come to expect from it. The specific gravity and complexity of a bell designed to fill a valley, even in the confined space of a bell chamber, even at the moderate impact energy of a maintenance mallet, producing a sound that organized the room around itself with a completeness that smaller sounds do not achieve. She stood with her eyes closed, not because she needed to close them. She was not taking measurements, not recording data, not analyzing, but because the act of closing them directed all her attention to the single channel she wanted open, and what she wanted was simply to hear. The principal tones assembled themselves in their harmonic architecture over the first 3 seconds, the nominal and the prime and the tiers, settling into their relationships with each other with the quality of resolution that Vorn had designed into them. The specific mathematical rightness of intervals that are not merely close to correct, but precisely correct. The difference being not quantitative but qualitative. The difference between a sentence that is almost grammatical and one that is. Then the upper partials began their faster decay, the higher frequency energy diminishing first, as it always does, the sound's texture becoming progressively simpler as the bell moved toward the long pure resonance of its lower tones. And then, at approximately 4 seconds after the strike, as her measurements predicted, as the individual pulse of dialto always emerged at this point in the decay, the rhythm appeared. The pulsatio geometrica, Vorn's geometric pulse, beating at 3.0 cycles per second in the sustained lower tone, with a regularity that was not the mechanical regularity of a metronome, but the living regularity of something that breathes, consistent, purposeful, inescapably present. She stood in the December cold and felt it in her sternum and the backs of her hands. She had felt it many times before, in this bell and in the other 2 survivors and in the recordings she had played and replayed in the year of analysis. But feeling it here in the room, in the physical presence of the object, with the cold stone around her and the caretaker standing quietly in his corner, was different from feeling it anywhere else. In the way that standing at the rim of a geological feature you have studied in cross-section is different from studying the cross-section. The abstraction inhabited by the body, in a way that no amount of symbolic processing produces. The mathematics was in the air was in her lungs. The geometry was completing itself through her. The tone decayed over 90 seconds, in the specific pattern her measurements had mapped, the tiers fading first, then the quint, then the nominal pulling back from the composite sound, and leaving the prime and the hum in a low register that still carried the pulse, still rhythmic at the very edge of perceptibility. The beat slowing almost imperceptibly as the partial tone amplitudes shifted and the interference pattern adjusted to the new balance of components. The pulse was the last thing to go. It outlasted the clarity of pitch, outlasted the harmonic richness of the sustained composite tone, persisting in the near silence of the final decay as the skeleton of the sound persists after the flesh of it has dissolved. Not because it was stronger than the other elements, but because it was more fundamental, built into the proportional structure of the bell, at a level deeper than any individual tone. The thing that the geometry had guaranteed would remain when everything else was uncertain. When it was gone, the silence was a different silence from before. Not empty but shaped, carrying the geometry of the sound, in the way that a mold carries the geometry of the object that cooled inside it. The negative space of a form that had been there, and was not now but was still present in its effects on the surrounding matter. She opened her eyes. The caretaker was watching her with the expression she recognized from her October visit, the expression of long familiarity with a remarkable thing, neither wonder nor indifference but the third thing, the state that comes after both, in which the remarkable thing is simply known and its presence is simply part of what the world is. He had watched many people hear this bell. He had watched them hear it with instruments and without, with preparation and without, with academic frameworks and with none. He had watched them arrive as experts and leave quieter than they came. He understood, without having analyzed it and without needing to, something about the relationship between the bell and the people who stood in the room with it, something about what the bell did to the quality of attention in a person who listened to it well, and he carried this understanding in the patient, unspoken way of people who inhabit extraordinary things daily and have arrived, through the long education of proximity, at a peace with the extraordinary that is itself a kind of wisdom. She looked at the altar hanging in the cold air of the chamber, 853 years old, and still carrying precisely what had been put into it, still saying what the mathematics had determined it would say, still releasing, with each strike, the sound that had been waiting in the geometry since the bronze cooled and the form became irrevocable, and the equation found its solution. She thought of a man working by a river in 1143, with a compass and a cracked drawing compass, and a wall full of diagrams, and 30 years of listening, understanding something about the relationship between shape and sound and time, that most people had not needed to understand, and a very few had needed desperately. She thought of a coppersmith's daughter, standing in a field in November, with a piece of charcoal and a sheet of bark, mapping the sound that nobody else had known to map. She thought of the curve drawn on vellum on an October afternoon, the small circle in the margin, the word hoc written in letters small enough to require a magnifying glass. This is the one. Thank you, she said to the caretaker. He nodded once, with the economy of someone for whom the gesture contained everything required, and replaced the mallet on its hook with the care of someone who respects tools. He moved toward the stairs. She followed, pausing at the threshold of the chamber to look back at the 3 bells in their frames, at the great one in the center, the 2 smaller ones at its flanks, the geometry of their hanging, exactly as Vorn had specified, the mathematics of their profiles exact within the tolerance of the instruments she had brought to measure them, and felt, in the cold air of the chamber, the specific quality of completion that comes not from a thing being finished, but from a thing being still, in the process of doing what it was made to do, still making its argument, still carrying its proof, still releasing into whatever air and ears are available the sound that the shape has always promised. The geometry persisted, the mathematics spoke, the bronze remembered, as bronze does, everything it had been told to be, and across the valley, she did not hear this, but she knew it from her measurements, from the sound maps she had built in October, from the data that confirmed what Isra had documented by hand 8 centuries before the pulse carried, further than the tone, further than the harmony, further than any single voice could reach alone. The rhythm of the geometry, traveling outward in the cold December air, arriving at the edges of the valley in a form diminished but intact, still counting something, still marking the interval between what was and what remains. The shape that Aurelius Vorn had drawn on a piece of vellum on an October morning in 1143, still speaking, still arriving, still, after all this time, absolutely itself. The story of Aurelius Vorn and the bells of Verenthis is at its heart, a story about the most ancient and most unresolved argument in human experience, the argument between the permanent and the passing, between what endures and what dissolves, between the things we make and the time that unmakes them. Vorn himself never framed it this way. He was a practical man, constitutionally resistant to the philosophical elaboration that his work invited, and he would likely have dismissed the grand framing in favor of the specific one, the profile curve, the partial tone, the precise weight of a clapper against the sound bow of a bell designed to carry across a valley. But the grand framing is there nonetheless, built into the work whether he acknowledged it or not, because every object made with sufficient intention becomes an argument about time, and the Verenthis bells were made with more intention than almost anything else the 12th century produced. What Vorn understood, what his 30 years of solitary listening had taught him, what the collaboration with Isra had refined and confirmed. what the great bell and its 6 companions embodied in bronze with a precision that 8 centuries of weather and war and the different passage of institutional memory could not erase, was that truth, when it is mathematical, does not age. The geometric relationship between form and sound is not a historical fact, contingent on the era in which it was discovered and subject to revision as the era passes. It is simply a fact. The way the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter is a fact, present before anyone calculated it, present after everyone who calculated it is gone, present in the bronze of a bell cast in 1143, and present in the spectrographic data of a researcher who pointed modern instruments at that bronze in the 21st century and found, to within 0.5% of sacrif, to within 0.5%. Exactly with Berinli, with Ackley, with within Lithinged, exactly within, with Withson, with a Vexet, with Rixo, with and with at a Hoet hit to it, with Fritworth, Cluck, where out at Wick, where of Whip, sat back, what with half at with West of App, with Bahat, pack at that, at that, off the Haggard, Bullfeck, Matgow, Afghan, past, Becker, Viscus, the equation does not know that 800 years have passed. The bronze does not know. The sound does not know. Only the humans know. And the humans, Vorn Isara, Marta, Solberg, the old woman who pressed her palm to the bell's flank by the roadside, the music teacher who said it sounds like it knows you are there, are the part of the story that is mortal, and therefore the part that gives the permanence its meaning. Without the passing witnesses, the permanent thing is simply itself, indifferent and complete. It is the witnesses who make it matter. It is the listening that makes the sound. The bells are still there. Die Alta hangs in its frame in the cold stone chamber above the valley that it was designed to fill. And on the mornings when it is rung for services, for ceremonies, for the occasions that cathedrals still mark in the lives of communities that have been marking them for 9 centuries, the sound rolls down the hillside and across the fields and reaches the edges of the valley in a form diminished but not defeated, carrying within it the pulse that Vorn encoded into its geometry, the rhythm that Isra was the first to name, the proof that the proposition was correct. People hear it without knowing its history. They hear it without knowing about a foundry beside a river in the year 1143, or a man with arthritic hands and pale grey eyes, or a woman with a piece of charcoal and a sheet of bark who walked to 400 meters to confirm that the mathematics was telling the truth. They hear it the way people have always heard it, as the sound of the place they inhabit, the acoustic signature of the time they live in, the voice that marks the beginning and end of things. They do not need the history for the bell to work. The bell works regardless, but the history is there for anyone who wants it, preserved in notebooks and manuscripts and spectrographic analyses, and the specific curve of a profile that a man drew on a piece of vellum on an October afternoon and marked with a small circle and the word hoc. This is the one. What remains, when the tone decays and the pulse fades and the silence returns to the valley, is the shape. Not the physical shape of the bell, though that remains to the bronze unchanged in its proportions, as geometrically precise as the day it cooled, but the shape that the sound makes in the air it has passed through, the geometry of its passage written in the temporary medium of pressure and wave, and the responsive architecture of the human ear and the human nervous system. The shape remains for a moment after the sound, the way warmth remains in a room after the fire goes out, the way light remains on the retina after the source is extinguished. And in that moment, in the space between the last perceptible trace of the sound and the return of ordinary silence, something is held that is not quite sound and not quite silence, but the boundary between them, the place where what was made meets what will be, where the intention of the maker persists in the world for one more breath before releasing into the ordinary. Vorn called this the truth of the bell. Isara called it the skeleton of the sound. Marta Solberg called it the amplitude modulation of the composite partial tone interference pattern, which is the most precise name and the least sufficient one. The old woman by the road who pressed her palm to the bronze and closed her eyes did not call it anything. She simply received it, as the body receives things that the mind has not yet learned to name, and stood still for a moment in the way of someone who has been told something important in a language they do not speak but understand. That is what the bells were always for. Good night, traveler. You have walked a long way today through foundries and cathedrals, through the cold air of bell chambers and the open fields of winter testing, through the notebooks of the dead and the instruments of the living, through 8 centuries of bronze and mathematics, and the patient, faithful persistence of things made well. You have heard, if you listened, a pulse inside a tone, a rhythm that no individual voice could carry, that required 7 voices, and 1 stone tower, and 1 valley, and 2 people who understood, between them, that geometry and sound were not separate languages, but the same sentence, spoken twice, once in space, and once in time. Rest now. The bells have said what they came to say, and the valley is quiet. And the stars over Verenthis are the same stars that Aurelius Vorn never looked at because he was always at his drawing table, working, and the same stars that Isra described once in a letter as looking like the partial tones of a bell she could not quite hear, too far away to identify individually, too numerous to count, but collectively unmistakable in their suggestion of an order that exceeds the mind's capacity to hold it all at once. Rest in that suggestion. Let the mathematics be, for tonight, something you carry in the body rather than the head, the 3-cycle pulse of a geometric rhythm still moving through air somewhere, still arriving at the edge of something, still counting whatever it is that bronze counts when no one is there to listen, and it rings in the dark for no one and for everything. The foundry fire is banked. The river moves over its stones in the dark, unhurried and purposeful, carrying no message and all messages, the way rivers always have. Somewhere in a stone tower an old bell rests in its frame, holding the exact curve of a man's best thinking, waiting for the next morning, the next strike, the next release of the sound it has been keeping since the bronze cooled and the mold was broken and the work was done and found to be good. It will ring tomorrow. It will ring the day after tomorrow. It will ring for as long as there are mornings and people to mark them, and perhaps, the mathematics suggests, a little longer than that. The geometry persisting in the form even after the last ringing, the shape outlasting the sound, the equation remaining after every solution has been heard and forgotten and heard again. Sleep well. The pulse goes on without you.